So if you've ever wondered if we're alone in the universe and what kind of enigma or secrets the skies may hold, you're in the right place. This is the conversation you'll want to be a part of. And I encourage you to post your questions in the chat wherever you're viewing. And there should be a link in the chat as well where you can ask a question and then upvote and downvote as well the questions of others. So I encourage you to do that. And before we begin, and before I invite the guests on the show, I just want to ask you a question. Do you think UAP, unidentified anomalous phenomena, represent a technology beyond anything humanity has created? Is this an actual form of non-human technology that we are encountering? Just put a simple yes or no or agree or disagree in the chat. It'd be good to get your opinion on that before we begin. And then before we dive in, just a moment to talk about Emergent as a whole. It is my hope in this new year ahead to have key conversations exploring the emergent new ideas, trends, and unfolding events that are reshaping our understanding of humanity and the human experience in light of this anomalous activity in our skies, in our oceans, and on land, and the increasing indications that there is a non-human intelligence in the world. I'll be having some wonderful, exciting guests on the show asking some of the challenging questions that probe at the enigma in some uncomfortable ways. Because as I have experienced in my life, and many of you do, I'm sure, to get into this phenomenon, you have to push through some hard thresholds. You have to continue to show up and step outside the comfort zone. So I certainly feel that as your host on this show, and you may feel that as a reader of the phenomenon, or if you're involved in some fashion, I'm sure you do as well. So with that, we will dive in. I would like to first give a little bit of a rundown of what we'll be covering today. So we'll put this up on screen. We're going to be looking at the science of UAP. What do we actually know after 80 years of analysis of this phenomenon? Are UAPs rewriting the laws of physics? The political future of UAP research under a new political administration in the United States. And then we will reflect from a scientific angle with my two guests as wonderful individuals to do so on the mystery drone debate that's currently raging. And then finally, we're going to have a conversation about NHI. And I'd also like to talk about catastrophic disclosure. Matthew, one of our guests here, has written a very important and insightful paper on the topic. So I'd like to get into that with him. And so with that, let me introduce Rich Hoffman. Rich is someone I've gotten to know and had some good conversations with over the last year. Rich is an Army IT defense contractor, serving as a senior systems engineer analyst at the U.S. Army Materiel Command headquarters in Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama. With a BA in organizational communication from Wright State University, Rich's extensive career spans IT, training and development, and organizational development across various sectors. Rich is a lifelong investigator of UFO phenomena. His passion began in 1964, inspired by the Lonnie Zamora sighting in Socorro, New Mexico. Early in his journey, he connected with Project Blue Book and Dr. J. Allen Hynek, later joining MUFON in 1969. It's a long time ago, where he helped hold multiple leadership roles over decades. In 2017, Rich co-founded the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies, SCU, a think tank of over 300 experts dedicated to scientifically analyzing UFO phenomena. He also serves as an advisor to organizations like the Society for UAP Studies and UAPX. And he is a sought-after speaker, appearing on hundreds of podcasts, as he's told me, TV, radio. He's been featured on the History Channel's The Proof is Out There and UFO Files. And in 2022, he presented on UAP threats at a NATO Space Domain conference. And he looks forward to continuing to contribute towards disclosure conversations in Washington, D.C. in the coming year. So welcome, Rich. And I'll go right into Matthew's bio here as well. Professor Matthew Szydagis received his BA, MS, and PhD from the University of Chicago, and then continued his work in physics as a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Davis. Since 2014, he's been a professor at the University at Albany, Department of Physics, pursuing experimental particle astrophysics, in particular the direct laboratory detection of dark matter, weakly interacting massive particles, or WIMPs. Um, he works on the LUX, Large Underground Xenon, and the LZ Liquid XE based experiments, and is the developer of the NEST, the Noble Element Simulation Technique. Matthew, we're going to need a little bit of a backstory on some of this, and more. He grew up watching Star Trek, The Next Generation, right away with season one from the age of 5 and fell in love with the character Lieutenant Commander Data, realizing that science officer was the position for him. He became a physicist after being inspired by the time travel and faster than light warp drives in Star Trek, and he realized that UAP may be tied to real life extraterrestrial incursions after the ATIP reveal in 2017 and the numerous trusted media outlets following up on it, including coverage of the Nimitz incident. And then lastly, recent discoveries by colleagues in the exoplanets field, especially numerous Earth like planets, caused him to question the assumption of Earth's uniqueness for life. So, with that, welcome, Rich and Matthew. Great to be with you.
Glad to be here.
How are you both?
Good.
Great.
Good.
For me.
We're good. Yeah, a big year so far, even in the first few days on the UAP topic. And I know last year was a big one with the hearings. The year before that with the second set of hearings in 2023. So all the more important to be here with you both. And I welcome you to the show and thank you for all your work on the issue. And though I'm not a scientist myself, I respect the need to bring credibility to the topic and to undergo rigorous and credible research, which you have both done. So kudos.
Thank you.
I'd like to just begin by asking you both just a question, stepping back into your experience of the phenomenon. Is there one piece of evidence or one experience that convinced you that UAP are not just a curiosity, but are something profoundly important worth study? And we can start with Rich. He's in the upper right of my screen there.
I'll be glad to talk about that. For me, I got started when I was 13 years old as a result of having to do this like crazy book report, or actually a presentation in my 8th grade science class of all things, right? And so after that happened, I got connected into the study of UFOs and actually getting involved in investigations. Uh, And I was curious about the phenomena. I noticed that it was a worldwide phenomena. It's certainly not just the United States, but that was happening everywhere. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And then I think for me, the aha moment, if you want to call it that, is not that I had a sighting myself, but I was actually doing an investigation in Carrollton, Ohio in the early 70s. And at that point, I was standing in the middle of a farm field where there had been UFO activity the night before. And in the middle of that wheat field was a 70-foot in diameter circular area where there was no wheat, and it was gone. And me and another team actually went into it and started investigating it. And we realized that when we were in the center of it, there was a depression. But as we began looking out and moving out from that center position, you'd find that number one, that there was no wheat or no roots left in the center. But as you gradually got out, you'd start to see a little bit of roots, and then you'd start to see a little bit further out a little bit of rubble, or it was coming up out of the ground. And then you saw a rotational pattern of the wheat, and then you had puffed wheat around the entire 70-foot in diameter area.
Wow.
And for me, and then you're looking around and you're saying, well, there's no way you could bring in equipment because all the other wheat would be down. And yet you're seeing this huge area where that happened. And you're realizing that the only way you could do something was basically from above, I mean, it was whatever it was is gone. And then it dissipated the entire roots of the wheat and the entire wheat. I mean, what's that story about? So bottom line for me, that was like having my own sighting, if you would, my own aha moment that said that there was something really else to this phenomenon. And it certainly was way beyond anything that we could possibly imagine.
Thank
That's
you.
my
Yeah.
story.
Well, I mean, nothing like being a firsthand witness and to do some observational field research to
Exactly.
get it in your bones.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Matthew, what about for you?
Well, for me, there are a couple different possible answers, and it depends on whether we're talking about my career or going back to childhood. And in terms of my scientific career, the answer is the one that everybody always gives, which is the Nimitz encounter. So we don't need to beat that to death, or the 2017 New York Times article. So instead, I'll rewind to earlier and talk about really initial interests, like Rich just did with school early on. And really, for me, I think the earliest example I can think of is watching Unsolved Mysteries with Robert Stack. And in
Mm.
particular, the episode that involved the Rendlesham Forest incident, and that scared the crap out of me as a kid with like the glowing red orb and stuff. So I think that's really my the earliest memory I have of being interested in this. And I think that that particular show, Unsolved Mysteries, with Robert Stack, really served to illustrate a sort of credibility that other programs wouldn't give this topic, because you'd have, serial killer, missing person, kidnapping, UFO, serial killer, kidnapping, missing person. It was just mixed in there. And so as a result, that kind of lent credibility to the topic at a time when I was a child, and the taboo in general was still, I would say, pretty strong.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Fascinating, guys. We all have our moment that piques us and makes us more than an interest, and something more like a passion, or even a calling, or even a mission. So I commend you both. You've both professionally been involved for a long time and have done a lot of important work. So as we go forward, feel free to share more of what keeps you going, because there's a lot of impedance and obfuscation and obstacles in the way of actually undertaking science and putting your career, your name, your credibility on the line to do so. So anything you can give the rest of the audience watching to inspire that in them, please do. But I'm sure you guys have even more to share on your stories for another episode. I thought we could start by talking about UAP. What are unidentified anomalous phenomena in the most basic terms? How would you define that? And are these strictly unidentified flying objects, or does this encompass a broader range of aerial phenomena or even a potential intelligence? And I'll put it to both of you and whoever wants to go
I'd be
first.
able, I'd be able to comment for sure. I've been through the whole litany of all the different name changes, everything from flying saucers to to UFOs to moving up the line. Uh, for me, it's a situation where, in the early days, of course, these things were being reported as flying saucers, right? A lot of flying discs was another thing that was, commonly referred to with these objects. But so we had a whole civil, cultural thing about flying saucers and stuff like that. And then, of course, you had the Blue Book era where you started to get into calling it UFOs, unidentified flying objects. And of course, if you think about that, that was connected to the Air Force. Well, the Air Force is not concerned about water; it's concerned about the air, right? And so, to them, it was flying, unidentified flying objects. But as we continue to move forward over time, we're starting to now look at them and saying, well, wait a minute, when you get the Navy involved in it, well, they're also like underwater. So suddenly the term flying doesn't make any sense. Do you say swimming? And we've always
Right.
struggled with the fact that, it's almost like you had to call one a USO, an unidentified submerged object, or you had to, when they're in the air, you had to call them a UFO. And it was like the terminology was like very, very difficult to deal with, right? And having a conversation. And so then, it got to be the point where it's like, well, wait a minute, they're transmedium. They're also in space.
Hmm.
So, if you look at back in the early days when we were getting involved with SCU, we came up with a term that it's an aerospace phenomenon. But and so even when we refer to UAP, we're saying unidentified aerospace phenomena.
Hmm.
However, what's over happened now is you're starting to get into the fact that we've switched from aerial into also calling it anomalous phenomena, which means that it's kind of takes it out of the ballpark of water, air, and everything else, that it's an anomaly that we need to check into. And so
Hmm.
I kind of go along with, being anomalous now more than I do pretty much anything else. But even when you look at Arrow, they call it the all domain because they realize that it's all those different domains. And
Right.
they call it anomaly resolution office. So it's coming to grips with what that term ought to be, and choosing that. And the stigma along the way has been a problem, and so they keep rebranding it something different. But I think, also I see the anomalous now including a lot more than just the typical UFO. It's getting into other kinds of things as well. So with that, I'll let Matthew chime in here.
So it's a really tough question to answer because there are a lot of contradictory definitions and opinions. So actually,
Mhm.
on the first page of UAPX's first scientific paper, we did our best um, to come up with some sort of definition without being too strict, but also not too vague. And it's a very tough line to walk. Many papers and
Mhm.
many groups have attempted to write down a definition, but I think it's one of those things that you can't really define. But I think we're doing better now. I agree that going to multiple domains helps also, because then you don't need to have separate words or acronyms like UFO and USO, because we could be talking about multiple domains, like Rich said, air, water, space. And so I do think the word anomaly is much better, or anomalous, to have in there,
Mhm.
and to not even refer to domain. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that we're probably conflating a vast number of related or maybe unrelated things that are phenomenon or objects, vehicles, craft, but also some sort of atmospheric phenomena, stuff like that. We may be throwing into.
Mhm.
Now, I do think it's good to broaden the umbrella, but I think we've also thrown in then a lot of potentially unrelated things. Some may be natural phenomena that have nothing to do with any kind of intelligence, and maybe some are vehicles and craft that do.
Can I
Yeah,
add to
please, Rich.
something that Matthew just said? And that he's spot on. There's a phenomena that's an atmospheric phenomena called the Earth, typically Earth lights. That's a very common term for them. Some people even call them spook lights or various other things. But it tends to be more of a glowing ball of gas, for the lack of anything else. And it
Mhm.
often is seen and gets reported as a UFO by many, and it also has some characteristics that are similar to that. And yet it's more of a natural phenomena, but it falls into that anomalous picture that you're looking into. So now you're going and stretching it beyond just the objects that you can identify that are definitely of interest, now into this other atmospheric phenomena.
Mhm. Great stuff. Thank you for that perspective.
Yeah.
And I want to ask about, are there consistent patterns that we see in what we might call UAP craft movements? Are there consistent reported morphologies of craft or surfaces, flight surfaces that would then say this is a UAP instead of, for example, a drone or a temporarily unattributable object?
I've been going first all the time. Matthew, why don't you go first, and then I'll chime in on you.
Sure. I think you just did a subtle switch. We're no longer talking about UAP. We're talking about IAP. You've identified them as some kind of craft. That's no longer UAP, because the U means it's unidentified. You just identified
Hmm.
it as a craft.
Yeah.
So I think we need to keep in mind that identification is not binary. What is that thing? Oh, it's a bird. You might think, okay, done. We identified it. No, what kind
Mhm.
of bird is it? So it's a seagull. That's not good enough. What's the genus and the species? This is an example my colleague, Professor Kevin Knuth, gives. And even that might not be good enough. Okay, this is the seagull named Bob, as opposed to Larry, right? So if we could do example with human identification. Oh, okay, an animal, a primate, a human being, a particular human being. So identification is not binary. So I think we
Mhm.
often conflate UAP with it's an alien spacecraft or non-human intelligence. And maybe some of them are, but I think those terms are not synonymous. We use them synonymously constantly, even subconsciously. But the U just means unidentified. So I'm okay with talking about the IAP you just mentioned, which is a craft. You've identified it as a craft,
Mhm.
but it's not you anymore. Now it's I. It's an IFO. It's an IAP. You have identified it as some kind of craft. So then we need to talk about what possible type of craft. But you've already made an additional identification by using that word craft, which is than emotionally loaded with a lot of connotation that's not necessarily part of the denotation.
Sure.
Right.
Interesting. Fascinating perspective. This is why I have scientists on the show.
Yeah, and
Rich,
there are
would you like to add?
yeah, sure. There are some objects, for example, like going back to Matthew's point, that let's say if you look at the Aska airline JAL flight that happened, this thing like literally, it's almost like it just appeared out of nowhere. And then the question was whether or not, and it disappears into nothingness. So was it really there? Well, it kind of was because it was picked up by two radar tracking stations, right? So there's an instance of something that's actually there that kind of just came out of nothing and there it is, and now it's gone again, right? But you also have objects that are out there that are also, I want to say like that they're spherical or they appear to be spherical or they're lights of some sort. And, they're not a craft per se, but they're more like maybe a light again or something like that. So we
Mhm.
run into the trap with it being called craft or an object because there are many things that we don't know. I mean, and you can look at it different ways. So we've tried to come up with morphologies and stuff like that. We find out that over a period of our studies and stuff like that, if you look at the maneuverability of these things, we think of shape having a certain thing in our atmosphere where it means something if it's slim and it can move through the atmosphere and not cause any kind of like sonic booms or any kind of thing like. But these objects can be any shape and they seemingly and any size, and they can
Mhm.
conceivably make the same kind of maneuvers either in water or in the air or potentially in space. Although there's not a lot of like evidence that I've seen about space, but you get what I'm saying, though, right?
Yeah. I'd like to put up on screen here, these are the 5 observables. I think this was
Sure.
first put out, I think through the ATIP program through Lou
Yep.
Elizondo, and I believe a 6th observable has been surmised. Let's put this on screen. Yeah, so we have anti-gravity lift, sudden and instantaneous acceleration, hypersonic velocities without signatures, low observability or cloaking, transmedium travel, and I've heard more recently biological effects. Now, are these how we might identify or differentiate a UAP from something that is more prosaic in origin, or we might surmise is prosaic? And I hear you, Matthew, about removing the craft word because craft then denotes all sorts of things, flight control, intelligence, intent, and things like that. Which it's possible that some of these phenomena are not intelligently piloted or are not actually craft. But how do you guys square up with the 5 or 6 observables at the moment?
Well, I'm familiar with at least 30 or 40 observables. If you read the doctoral thesis of Dr. Joshua Pearson, who's looked into this, I think this is a woefully short list. Perhaps it was identified within the government as the most important ones, but I think one could add on and on and on to the list, which I think just from the 5 or 6 that you show, most of those already imply a craft. So when you say anti-gravity lift, we're not talking about helium balloons, right? They have an anti-gravity lift, right? But that I
Mhm.
don't think that's what we're talking about when we put up that list. So there are words on there like travel and signature management or cloaking. That again implies we're talking about a vehicle of some kind. We're not saying whether it's intelligently or remotely controlled or human or non-human. But we are
Right.
immediately saying that we're talking about a craft of some kind when we look at this list.
So great stuff. So how would you guys, in your two respective organizations, and I know you're both, I think you might both participate in both, so both SCU and UAPX, how do you approach undertaking original research into UAP? Do you basically state a research problem and then basically identify methodology and then design a project or study, or how do you approach something as broadly undefined as unidentified anomalous phenomena?
I could speak to what we do in SEU. I mean, we define that there's a potential characteristic or some aspect of the phenomena that we want to study. So, for example, if you're looking for reports or anything that we can find on propulsion effects or some effect in the atmosphere that you could look at. So what do you do with that? You start to look at cases that potentially where there's a description of some sort of a characteristic around the craft that you now have a desire that you want to look into. And then you form that team of other potential scientists or researchers or stuff like that to go against databases to now come up with some sort of a methodology, if you would, to find out of the large number of cases that are reported. We're looking now for the ones that have and we have a criterion where we break it down to getting out the best cases we can possibly come up with. Ones that have had either an investigation or some sort of like study, or they've been verified, or something like that to have occurred. That type of thing. You kind of like come up with a criteria, and then from the criteria, you've reduced the population of cases that you've got now, and you're looking at specific aspects of those cases. And you might find that, for example, there was some sort of tool that was used to help you get an idea that there was some aspect of that, or you have a situation where you've got multiple witnesses that have seen some aspect of something in the air. So now you're doing that, and so over a period of time, you're doing the study and the research on that. You're looking at like things like the frequency distributions that might have happened on this. Like, is there certain areas that this happens in? And this is kind of like the approach that we take with that. And we've done it against things like nuclear intent. For example, they're looking at, are these things hanging out at nuclear sites or not? And we've gone and done that kind of like level of scrutiny and spent years looking at just cases around nuclear intent. And so that's kind of like just a high level kind of like way we approach it. And we're continuing to do that. We're looking at kinematic shape and seeing if that's important. We're looking at, have they made changes over a period of history and time? We're looking at, other kinds of things like, for example, going back to the UFOs that we talked about, where are they most frequently seen? Like, what can we deduce from looking at those cases? And pulling out from there any kind of like lessons we can learn from that. We might also look into luminosity of the objects, that kind of characteristic. And so a group of people might have an interest in looking at that. There's reports of things like light coming down out of a UFO that actually make a 90-degree turn. Have you ever heard of that? Or how about what they call almost like a solid light that's coming down? And those are very unique descriptions, but they seem to be repeatably in the context of a lot of UFO reports. So now you can go against studying that and finding out what you can learn from that. And with that, I'll just, Matthew.
Fascinating. And I want to revisit a few of those topics with you later on. But yes, Matthew, as a professor of physics, tell us about that side of the equation.
So yeah, we have a methodology on UAPX. I should say I'm also a member of SCU, and I was a member of SCU first. There are a lot of different organizations, and on SCU we've laid out our methods in our scientific peer-reviewed publication. They're very similar to those of other groups like Galileo Project. There's in fact a paper by Professor Wes Waters of Wellesley College that we cite in the UAPX paper, where we have a very simple philosophy, which is we use historical cases, and you can create lists like, for example, the famous list of observables from, I believe it was from Lou Elizondo or maybe Chris Mellon originally, right, that you just showed. We can look at lists like that and say what has been alleged to have happened and build sensors around that. So the key thing here is that, tying back to our original discussion, doing so does not require you to define what you're looking for. This seems counterintuitive, but basically we can list the symptoms without knowing the disease. We can list the effects without knowing the cause. And so our philosophy, me and the other scientists and team members on UAPX, is to look at historical cases like Rich was saying, that SCU does as well, but then use that in order to justify sensor choice, just like, as I said, Dr. Waters and Avi Loeb speak of for the Galileo Project. Another similar organization is you don't just trust every crazy story from eyewitness testimony, but you don't throw it out either. like skeptics want and debunkers especially want to do. What you do is you instead of either ignoring or taking testimony wholesale, we opt for a middle of the road approach, which is you look at historical cases in the witness testimony and you use that to justify your choice of sensors. So obviously you're going to want to have cameras. Maybe you want to have different wavelengths because supposedly they're invisible in one wavelength, visible in another. So you want maybe infrared. You want to have multiple cameras to get different angles. But there's also the biological effects, like claims of radiation harm, damage from ionizing radiation has been alleged multiple times. There's the Rendlesham Forest case I mentioned earlier. There's Cash Landrum in Texas. Does that mean you believe them automatically? These very, very crazy stories, right? No, but you say, what if it is true? That justifies your choice of sensors. So that's why, for example, in UAPX, we don't just use cameras, we use radiation detectors. Plenty of stories. Rich could probably, we'll talk your ear off about all the stories of high magnetic fields, alleged electromagnetic fields, cars being turned off, things like that. Very famous, right? It's in the X-Files, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. My colleague, Professor Knuth, always talks about that. Great. Then you bring electromagnetic field sensors as well. So see, you don't automatically believe all the stories, but what you do is you use them to justify your choice of sensors. And so one thing, though, they don't teach you about the scientific method is it's not just the 5th grade textbook version where you start with a hypothesis. That's not how all science is. Science isn't always hypothesis driven. You could be agnostic and be like, well, let's just figure things out and let's just poke around, take some data and see what we get. So the scientific method at its most fundamental core is not just 5 steps you memorize in your middle school textbook or in high school. It's really about testing ideas against the real world. And if the real world disagrees with your idea, get better ideas. Your ideas are wrong. That's the way I summarize the scientific method without going into just going into a gory detail of multiple steps. But it's important to remember is that your initial idea doesn't actually have to be an official hypothesis. You might not have a hypothesis, oh, it's extraterrestrial craft, it's this or that. It may be good to have a hypothesis, but instead what you can do is just collect data and look at it. So there are ways of conducting science where you can do a non-hypothesis driven approach and instead have it be driven by, again, the effects you're studying without even knowing what the cause is, and then work your way towards hypothesis or hypotheses by eliminating things.
Fascinating. And I don't know if that's inductive reasoning or parallel to it, but instead of deductive, but observation-driven discovery without having an idea necessarily about the final,
Well, there's
framing
actually
of what you're
three kinds
undertaking.
of reasoning. It's not just deductive and inductive. There's also abductive, which is a fancy way of saying wild ass guess. But that's also valid. And many scientific discoveries have been done with abductive reasoning. I'll just make this up and see if it works. So there's actually at least 3 kinds of reasoning.
Yeah. I love this, and I watched you in a Tear in the Sky, a documentary. I believe it was released in 2022, which chronicled UAPX's efforts to undertake a multi-sensor detection project near Catalina Island, Avalon, California. And I'm curious, because multi-sensor data seems to be kind of, the holy grail of this, right? Which is, can you capture an event on multiple sensors, including eyewitness testimony, and in a way that's non-fungible, cross-corroborated? Where does UAP science stand right now with that? What are you most excited about? What is the kind of data or domain of collection that you're most feeling that could basically substantiate what it is we're observing?
Well, I'm most excited about cross-correlating different types of sensors. So you have an anomaly on your magnetic field detector at the same time as your ionizing radiation detector, at the same time as your camera, where you have an object in the camera that's not immediately identifiable as a bird or plane, something prosaic. So what gets me really excited is the idea of cross correlation of anomalies that are near simultaneous across not just 2 or more cameras, but better than that, 2 or more different types of sensors entirely, where without even knowing what you're looking for or looking at, you're looking at statistical outliers, where you have a statistical outlier across different types of sensors within a narrow time window that allows you to say something anomalous happened. And it can't be something prosaic, because why is it across these very different types of sensors?
Right. Rich, how about in your world? What are you most excited about?
Well, I think, for me, the advance in technology that I've seen over my lifetime. I mean, you have to realize that when I started doing investigations, it was pencil and paper and everything else, right? I mean, and you're just going out and talking to a witness. I mean, we didn't even have it hardly for many years. We didn't even have like a tape recorder, and so now you got a tape recorder. Or you'd go out there with a little compass and see if you could read anything. So if you go back to the early days of like the study and research, you have to put that in the context of it was largely just anecdotal kind of testimony from witnesses, where you really didn't have a whole lot of instrumentation that you could take with you to do anything with it, right? And so
Right.
what we've seen now is, I mean, what I've seen over my lifetime is I've got this wonderful thing called an iPhone that I can go to where I can conduct, I mean, everything from seeing you at the same time you're seeing something to now looking at the aircraft that are overhead, looking at satellites that you got overhead, looking at a whole bunch of things that I couldn't do before, and I can do that. And so what I've seen is this incredible amount of technology growth that's happened, and the fact that it's even becoming to the point where it's the cost of it are down to at least within a reason that most people can get involved with it. And then to have people like Matthew and the UAPX team, and all these other kinds of studies that are going on with great technology tools, where we're actually investing in it, and then add into the fact that now we've got military technology that has the capability of like the FLIR cameras and stuff like that are suddenly allowing them to see all these objects where they weren't seeing it before. So I think that technology for me is the most exciting to watch, and I think that that's where we're going to start to learn more about these things. You have to look at it from the standpoint of even camera technology that's I've seen change happen over my lifetime with Instamatics and box cameras, and now we're up to the even the cell phone or the iPhone is and stuff like that has got incredible capabilities. So I think that, and then add into the fact that we're starting to see things in other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, like infrared and stuff like that. I think that there's much more in the spectrum that we could engage in and learn a lot from if we had those tools to be able to go at this phenomena, right?
Yeah,
I'd like
fascinating.
to
And go ahead, Matthew.
I'd just like to add to what Rich said, to piggyback on what I said, because another thing that's excited me, because Rich was speaking of advances in technology, I find it remarkable. I can sit down and in 30, 40 minutes, probably less than that if I use help of ChatGPT, for example, I can write a piece of code. I'm a programmer in C++, and I can write a piece of code that'll check 100 billion different versions of the Drake equation. And Frank Drake couldn't do that. Computers were like, garbage. They took up a whole room and would take several minutes to do 2 + 2 = 4, right? And now I can sit down on a laptop that's a fraction of the size of computers from, Frank Drake's heyday, and do what he couldn't have even dreamt of when he came up with his famous Drake equation for estimating how much extraterrestrial civilizations are out there. That's only one example. I can take any scientific question or problem now and write computer code to simulate possible answers, study possible answers, and do a quick simulation in the time that it would have taken. It would have taken the old way on pen and paper, would have taken centuries or millennia to answer
Hmm.
questions that we now can trivially answer on a computer that isn't even meant to be a supercomputer, but just a home laptop, and we can just trivially answer incredibly complex questions now.
There's a
So in
there's
terms
a
of, go ahead, Rich.
I just got to point out to you also, while I'm embracing the technology, there's also a problem with the technology that's on the negative side, and that is that as we continue to see things like, Matthew points to the fact that machine learning is great for study and stuff like that, but like, AI tools are going to make it even more difficult for ufologists to be able, or UAP researchers to look at video or that type thing and to not question that that hasn't been AI generated, and how do you go about dealing with that? And then couple that fact with the fact that now you've got social media that doubt throws out this stuff. And now you've got an entire gullible world that buys into the fact that that's a legitimate UFO or whatever like that. And now you're having to you're out there trying to debunk it and clarify. No, that's not what it is. Oh, but wait a minute. We don't listen to you because
Right.
we're going to accept the fact that that's what that is. So critical thinking skills have gone by the way of the dodo, and now all these tools are out there that can create incredible fakes. That it's going to be a definite problem for us going forward.
I agree with
This is
Rich
a
that as technology has improved, so has the ability to do fakery. So, but
Mhm.
I'm actually going to be adding a paragraph about this to my catastrophic disclosure paper because there are a couple easy solutions we can use right now. I'm sure they won't work anymore in 10 years. Fingers. AI can't count the correct number of fingers, and signs. It can't do letters. And so I'm going to add a paragraph to my paper suggesting, look, in order to demonstrate your video is not fake AI, like wiggle your fingers in front of it and show a sign. Because try it. Use Midjourney, use Dolly, and ask. And it cannot generate human language, and it'll get the number of fingers wrong. Like there's the famous six-fingered Trump picture. But Rich is right. Technology always improves. In 10 years, AI will be near perfect on these two things, and we will laugh, oh, remember the crappy old AI? And so it's always a race between positive and negative aspects of technology. And it's not a simple race. Sometimes one is in the lead, and sometimes the darker side is.
Hmm. Interesting, guys. This is great. Yeah, I saw it on ChatGPT today that Sora AI just popped in to my toolkit for the first time. And, this is another one of these text to video tools that is surmised to be able to produce unbelievably undetectable, nearly undetectable uh, AI generated video. So I'm curious then, so are we at the cusp where we have the technology to detect on multiple sensor platforms in a way that would produce a smoking gun type piece of evidence? Or are we not there yet? Or is there another issue? Funding, political will, does the military have the tech and we don't? Where do we stand with being able to do this and produce that level of substantiation of the phenomenon?
Well, I think that I think it's I agree with my colleague Professor Kevin Knuth actually that I think looking for so-called smoking gun evidence, I think that's a wrong approach. That's never going to happen ever. You could have the best evidence ever, and a determined skeptic will figure something out.
Mhm.
I've joked in one of my essays. I think that aliens could land in Mick West's backyard, and he'd say, "Oh, it's a lens flare or seagulls." So I don't think there's such a thing. There is no such thing as smoking gun evidence
That's
of
right.
anything, frankly. But what you do have is you collect bits and pieces that meet some kind of critical threshold. And what that critical threshold is, again, is arbitrary because it depends on whether they're talking about scientific community. Well, which science? Or are we talking about citizen scientists or the general public? So I think there's sort of like um, it's like many things in life, art and porn, and the famous quote from a Supreme Court justice. I think there's obvious examples of either, and then there's a gray area. I think there's evidence that's like obviously not good enough, evidence that's obviously good enough, and I think there's a yellow zone or gray zone. And I think that the right approach is, like I said earlier, is you collect evidence across different sensors because I think it's very unlikely, you're going to get the video of the alien mothership with like beings waving from the window, because even if you did, nobody would believe it. They'd say that's
Yeah.
Photoshop, that's CGI, that's an AI generated image or video from Dolly or Midjourney or one of these pieces of software. So I think because of the AI tools, which Rich has so well summarized and mentioned, because of that, I don't think it's even possible anymore to get
Mhm.
so-called smoking gun evidence. Maybe it could have been decades ago, but that ship has sailed with the advent of very good fakery. I think that it's now the threshold is just that much higher now for real evidence of anything.
Yeah, I mean, the reality collapse that we're experiencing societally, with trust, fake news and altered or doctored information.
Yeah.
And, like, I'm with you 100%. Hard evidence is a very soft argument in my view, and a very it's a very ready one that people use to dismiss the phenomenon because it has to do with evidentiary requirements. And so, who are we talking about? Convince who? You're right. The hardest of all evidence could be not enough, given trust, given other elements where people might doubt reality itself. I want to ask you both, where do we stand in terms of our understanding of the science behind the propulsion? Because I know in Lou Elizondo's book, Imminent, he talks about these anti-gravity bubbles, and I'm way outside my knowledge zone here, so correct me. You both are the scientists in the room, but where do we stand with understanding what is allowing these craft to do what they do, the energetic potential, the maneuvers, and is that going to cause a massive shift in our understanding of physics, or is this something we would more slowly integrate over time?
I think for me, it's a situation where, like, without, I mean, the craft themselves perform incredibly, well beyond anything that we can think of. And they don't seemingly use like combustion engines to be able to go anywhere, right? They're doing something. And the problem we have is that they're so elusive. I mean, an object is in the air, so people see it, and then it's gone, right? I mean, unless you had, and so you're trying to make observations about it from the fact that it was up there, and now it's gone. And or if you have, like, the sensors, you might be able to do something with it where you could help to be able to figure that problem out. But all these things about warp bubbles and stuff, they're all theoretical. I mean, they're all conceptual, trying to think out, well, how will we do that? And Matthew's already shared the fact that that he had an interest in Star Trek and stuff like that early on. So did I. And the bottom line is, what we've seen is, we see something on the show and we think, that's a great communicator. We ought to have something like that, and then it kind of like puts in our brain to where we can actually, that's a great idea. We ought to look into that. And so somebody goes and explores it and comes up with that idea, and it develops it over time, right? So I think that, ultimately, I think science is going to eventually advance to the point where we'll be able to get better at it, but we don't really know how these things fly. We can sit here. We've not been in one. We haven't had an interview with somebody that was on the inside and said, "How do you do this?" Right? And so you're left with speculating and trying to come up with ideas. You're trying to say, "Well, wait a minute." And that's part of the reason why we want to look for those, like, those effects that I was mentioning about, looking at that and saying, is there something about these things? Like, for example, let's go back to that object that was in that wheat field. Did it actually have a field around the craft that actually then did all that work to destroying the plant life and everything else? And so, okay, can we see that in other cases? Well, there's other cases out there where you don't see that kind of an effect. And then I can cite cases like the Delphos, Kansas case, where you had, ground glowing for 4 nights. So I mean, there are effects that you can see and you can try to figure out, but we don't also see a consistency and say every object performs that way, and that's what is going to do the breakthrough. I think we have to be very sensitive to the fact that there's a lot of variations on the UFOs or UAP, and we have to, going back to what you talked about in terms of morphology, we got to figure out, well, like, for example, flying saucers used to, when they hovered, they had like a falling leaf kind of pattern to them. Now we have triangular craft that are staying up there perfectly still.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's a difference between those shapes, and there's something that's different about them that we don't understand. And why is it maybe that they improved their design or something of that nature to where that they didn't have that falling leaf? Or is there something about the disc shape that creates that? We don't know yet. And let me go back to just one other point here real quick, and I'll shut up. It was right after 1969 when they closed Project Blue Book. I call it the Dark Ages. Scientists were discouraged from doing any study on this phenomena. The National Academy of Sciences said, yea, verily, there's nothing to it. They're not going to support research. So people like Matthew Szydagis here, Dr. Matthew was discouraged from doing anything up until we get to about 2017, when the announcement comes out that gave it the legs to be able to go and to do this. And we start having scientists like Matthew that are coming out of the closet that are now willing to do it. And so now scientists are really engaging for the very first time in a long time, to where we can actually now come up with better understanding So, hats off to Matthew and Dr. Knuth as well, because I'm encouraged the fact that they're engaged in this. This is a rare thing. It didn't happen in my early years.
Yeah, I want to talk to you both about the changing political environment and how that is supportive or not of UAP science. So I look forward to that. And just to back up briefly, Matthew, I totally understand. I know I went back to craft, and maybe that's the subtle intellectual, you know, transit we have to be careful of, which is like the moment you start talking about, propeller and or propulsion, we get into maybe a subset of UAP, and that's
Yeah.
just a subtle mental shift that happens that's maybe not helpful. So I was aware of that. I maybe I caught myself doing it thanks to you.
But yeah, let me answer your original question about
Yeah.
propulsion. But yeah, the very first thing I was going to say, by saying propulsion, we're not talking about UAP anymore. We're talking about IAP. You have identified them as craft with some interesting technology, and that's fine. I'm willing to entertain definitely the possibility it's that some tiny sliver. I'm not willing to, to put a percentage to it or anything, but I'm willing to entertain the idea of a tiny sliver of UAP are actually craft of some kind. But again, a tiny sliver, because does a ball of light need propulsion? I don't know. You know what I mean? Like there's a, like, do Rich's Earthlights need propulsion? I think that's not a valid question. But if we're talking about craft in particular that seem to be exhibiting exotic behavior, I have a lot to say about that. So first of all, I think I agree with Professor Avi Loeb that it's very dangerous to start talking about new physics. It's completely unnecessary. And let me explain why. We need to distinguish between new physics and new engineering. I think everyone always immediately jumps, new laws of physics. And those are always non-physicists who say that. And frankly, I have no idea what they're talking about, because I'll give you a concrete example to prove my point. Take an airplane, and let's take an airplane and put it in the year 1700. Okay, people saw that and be like, "Oh my God, it's against the laws of physics." Do you know why I picked the year 1700? Because we already had Newton's laws. Airplanes work with Bernoulli's principle and Newton's third law, and so I think it's, to me, saying something I'm much more willing to say. Something is extraterrestrial, interdimensional, non-human intelligence. I'm willing to entertain that. I am almost not willing to say, we need new laws of physics. That's a conceptual leap so huge, you have to believe me, it dwarfs the conceptual leap to claim that non-human intelligences exist. You don't need it. So here's another example. So rockets. How many centuries did it take us to develop rockets? We already had the known physics from Newton. It's same as a similar example, airplanes. What took us so long? Why did it take us centuries to figure out? We knew how to make airplanes in the late 1600s. What the hell took us so long? Because it's engineering. So I think a lot of times when people say it's against the laws of physics, it's new physics, they really mean engineering. They have no idea what they're talking about. So I agree with Avi Loeb and Sean Kirkpatrick, former head of Aero, on this. I disagree with him on a huge amount of stuff. Don't get me wrong. But like on this, he's right. Like I'm not claiming there isn't new physics to discover. Sure there is. But shouldn't we walk before we run? So we have not yet figured out, for example, how to use Einstein's theory of relativity and create relativistic propulsion. So shouldn't we first guess or assume, maybe there's new engineering that uses relativity? We have not yet used relativity. It goes back to 1916. We have yet to use Einstein's general theory of relativity to create some kind of technology or propulsion. I mean, there's GPS and things like that, but I'm talking specifically in terms of propulsion. And again, rockets and airplanes, it took centuries to figure those things out after we already knew the applicable laws of physics. So I think we need to distinguish between new physics and new engineering. I can think of off the top of my head at least 2 or 3 different ways to, at least in a speculative way, to traverse the air without making a sonic boom. I don't need magical new laws of physics that are beyond our current understanding. I don't. Okay. And so
Yeah.
I think that we should, and warp drives and wormholes, those are all things that we already had the math for since 1916 or even 1915 from Albert Einstein. Those are not new physics. So to create warp drives and wormholes would require new engineering not necessarily new physics. Now, to be clear, is there plenty more physics to discover? You bet. We have no idea what dark matter is. We have no idea what dark energy is. But even with exotic stuff like this topic, I still want to apply Occam's razor. First, let's talk about new engineering. And then let's talk about new physics. I think it's premature to abandon bedrock principles like conservation of momentum, conservation of energy. So, for example, people say, "Oh, this UFO violates conservation of momentum." Not necessarily. It might have a propellant that's invisible. So it is propelling itself using rocketry, but the propellant is invisible. So it looks like it's violating conservation of momentum. So I think we shouldn't be too quick to chuck bedrock principles that allow us to have created computers and GPS and the internet. So clearly the little bit that we know about the universe, which I acknowledge is a little bit, it is well known. The little bit that we know, because our knowledge is very incomplete, the bit that we do know about the universe, we do know very well, because it allowed us to make computers and telescopes and microscopes. And in fact, when we first discovered nuclear decay, and particularly beta decay, some physicists were ready to throw out conservation of energy. When it turns out, nope, there was this invisible particle called the neutrino that was carrying away energy and mass. So it turns out conservation of energy and momentum were correct. So I think we should look to engineering first before we look to new physics. And I taught a course about this, by the way, for Society for UAP Studies. I taught an online course on exotic propulsion just this past year, just last year, where I talked about a lot of these things.
Thank you for that. I think that's a critical perspective because, outside the scientific, I do see folks kind of abandon first principles thinking and what we do know in the entertaining of a non-human intelligence, for example. Well, our human ethics, morals, religions, they must be primitive, theirs must be advanced. Let's leap from our square to theirs. And, to expand our understanding of the physics without abandoning or thinking we should basically reinvent physics. I mean, and I love what you've shared there on the semantics of that, but also kind of some of the history that drone situation. Actually, it was my hope to have two individuals engaged in UAP science on the show to reflect back on the UAP. I'm sorry, on the drone situation with that scientific lens. So, if I may ask you both, how are you viewing this at this point? Are you viewing this um, as a mixed bag of multiple phenomenon? Are you seeing indications of prosaic craft? We're on craft again, or are you seeing indications of more traditional UAP activity in what we're observing?
Are you talking specifically about the New Jersey flap?
Whoever wants to take it, I think we lost Rich's camera there.
Yeah, for some reason, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Lost your
Well,
camera though.
I don't know where my camera went. It's working fine, but somehow it just disappeared. I didn't even touch anything, so I don't know what's
Okay.
going on. But let me address your question here, and that is that one of the things that I've noticed is that there's been over looking at all the different reports and getting asked all the time on shows like the proof is out there and stuff like that. What do I think that these objects are that they want to call UFOs? And it tends to be always like a lot of them are drones. And well, why? I mean, why is it that we're calling out drones when there's a whole bunch of IFOs that are out there that we're not talking about those, but we are talking about these drone things. And for some reason, they're seemingly getting, well, they become very, very popular. And so consequently, with a million of these things sold across the country, people are now, I'm a drone pilot, and I think even Matthew is as well. I mean, we can go out now and suddenly we can fly at night where we couldn't do that before, right? And so, and they're typically like lighted. Many of them don't have the proper like remote ID that we're supposed to be having on them now because they're not paying attention to the rules that the FAA has set up. There's a lot of hobbyists that are out there that are as early and young as 14 years old that have now got one of these drones and they want to go out and fly it. So suddenly they got it up in the air. And so what you see is a large number of these people now able to fly them at night with similar kind of light. And guess what? They kind of like, they can hover in one position or be there in that sky, which is similar to a UFO. And then when they see them moving away, they think, wow, that moved away pretty quick. And it was merely because it was close in proximity to that observer, right? So it's like, wow, look at that. That shut off and did some incredible kinds of like maneuvers. They can do all ups and they can do downs. And again, it looks like, that could be a UFO. And so consequently, the public, who is very ignorant about this kind of stuff, and by the way, I can tell you over my years, I investigated people that were seeing like the planet Venus, the planet Jupiter up in the sky. And they were all calling them UFOs. I had a group of 30 people standing out there telling me that they saw it. It was the planet Venus. So, I mean, you have a vast number of people who are not familiar with them who are now seeing them. And if you go look at the previous UFO flaps, these are a flap is considered to be a large volume of craft in a given, maybe a geographical area or something of that nature. And so there's a large number of these. In 1965 and 66, there was a flap that I was investigating. In 1973, there was a flap that I was investigating. And what preempted that was this: a lot of people seeing something maybe initially that could have been called a UFO. Then you had the news media get involved, and suddenly it's on the evening news, and everybody's saying, "Oh my God, that's incredible! We had them." And so suddenly, every aircraft that's flying across the sky, every helicopter becomes a
Mhm.
UFO. And then it gets reported more and more by the media. And then the next thing
Right.
happens is now you're interviewing politicians, and they're flummoxed. They have no concept of what the heck it was. And they're all making absurd statements about it, like that it's this. And that's what we're seeing in this New Jersey and New York thing, is that now you got people getting on, and you have people like politicians and stuff like that saying, well, it's the Iranians, off the coast. And
Right.
I'm
Right.
like, excuse me, they're just machines that people are flying in the air that they're allowed to finally do, and maybe it's illegal, but they're lit up at night, and so consequently, and it's easier for people to report something at night than it is during the day. They don't see them during the day, but they see
Right.
them at
Rich, if I may interrupt, just to add a little bit more dimension, because those who've been watching this have noted that the shape of the craft had been estimated, could be a misestimate for sure, to be somewhat large, the size of an SUV or a small truck. I was on a call yesterday, actually, by the UAP Disclosure Fund, which featured Chris Grooms, who's a Nebraska police deputy, decorated military, multiple tours in Afghanistan, knows his stuff, I would imagine, about everything military and craft and aircraft. And he recounted this incident at the end of 2019 in Nebraska, where he was called in to observe this object, reddish orange light. Looking at my notes here from yesterday, and it was the size of his pickup truck. He estimated Ram 1500, or about that size. He estimated at 3/4 of a mile distance from him, and he briefly looked away at another light on a building, I believe, on the other side of his vehicle. And by the time he had looked back, this object had transited, he estimated 3/4 of a mile in, somewhere between 2 and 5 seconds, which would be potentially over 900 miles an hour. Which, and I'm just, this is a trained observer, first responder, someone who's used to craft, vehicles, drones. He actually has experience with them. I actually was about to get him on the show, but he had a family medical situation, so otherwise would have been here to tell that story himself. But how do we reflect on a report like that?
very
Well,
simply. Yeah, very simply. Let me tell you. First off, from all my years of going and talking to people, their estimations of size are grossly inaccurate, especially when there's no kind of like reference point for making that determination. And if you throw something up in the air, if I took a car and placed it up in the air, would you be able to? And I put it at distance and progressively got it more and more distant. Again, making the determination of size doesn't equate. Then the other part of that is, do you know the typical sizes of drones, and the fact that there might be some as big as like 8 to 10 feet in diameter? And then you place an 8 to 10 foot in diameter object at a relatively smaller field, or just below above them or something like that. and oh my God, it's as big as a truck. So, I mean, I'm sorry. I don't necessarily buy everybody's accountability because humans are very, very poor at determining things like size like that and
Mhm.
speeds because we find out that they have, again, no reference points for it. And a lot of times they're seeing it on the ground or very close to them and it looks like it's moving away quickly. I mean, so I guess what I'm trying to tell you, this is why we rely on data from equipment more than we rely on human testimony because it's fallible.
I'd like to jump in on
Exactly.
this because I've got a lot to
Yeah.
say about this topic actually, because we have an entire section on this in the UAPX paper. So Rich is correct, and it's even worse than what he just said. And this always drives me nuts, these size and distance estimates. It makes me want to pull out my hair. They're all wrong. It's mathematically impossible. You cannot tell the size of an object unless you have a second angle. It's simple trigonometry. So when you just quoted a size and a distance, that's mathematically impossible. Unless you had a second person and knew trigonometry and wrote down the angles, you cannot tell the size and the distance. If you know the size, then you can estimate the distance. If you know the distance, then you can estimate the size. These estimates in size and distance are completely made up. And it's high school trigonometry. So we have a section on this in the UAPX paper where we go through and show you cannot know the size and distance of something unless you have two
Mhm.
perspectives. And Mick West is going on and on always about this, and I disagree with him with like 99% obviously what he says, but on this he's right, is you have no way of knowing whether an object is small and really close to you or big and really far away. They're
That's
the
right.
same mathematically. It's literally what you just said a
Mm.
few minutes ago, Reed, which I know you're quoting eyewitness testimony. It's literally mathematically impossible. You cannot do it. The
Yep.
only
Right.
exception is something is nearby within the human field of view with reference points, where something is in front of something else and you have reliable reference points. That's the only exception for being able to estimate the size or distance of something. Otherwise, people are just making these numbers up. And if you test them, like Rich said with drones, you'll find like I could convince somebody that a drone is an 800-foot aircraft carrier UFO really easily, especially at night. And so, in
Mm.
terms of the New Jersey flap, your original question, I totally agree with Rich. I think it's probably started with some legitimate UAP and something interesting happening, but then it just piled on with mass hysteria of everyone calling every single airplane and a helicopter UFO. And I think that in the modern era, that's easier to happen than decades ago. Decades ago, you still had UFO flaps, as they're called, but now with internet, you can take a seed, a grain of truth, where there is a
Right.
truly anomalous thing initially, and maybe it's one or two sightings, and suddenly it balloons to 5,000 because everyone starts calling every airplane and helicopter and every hobbyist drone in the sky they see. They start saying UFO, 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 and
Yeah,
it rapidly spirals out of control.
Matt.
So
And
let
also,
me ask you then. So how would we deal with this? Because if people are reporting this and misattributing, misidentifying, or overestimating the number, and it's like a feedback loop, right? So like, what would be the solution to effectively decode what's going on in our skies? Because there are indications it is, well, the government is saying it's happening, and
well,
they don't know what it is, and it's not foreign adversarial, and it's not us. So there is this crisis of clarity and transparency.
yeah.
And so what would be the path forward here?
Money.
Well,
Give money to people like me and Rich and our organizations. Give us some damn money so we can finally deploy cameras, deploy sensors, and actually help. Give money to scientists and citizen scientists and organizations that want to find the truth and don't want to call everything under every rock a UFO. That's the solution.
the other thing you have that Reed is that I'm big on education. Okay, so there many moons ago, the Air Force actually gave out things for aids to identification. And it was a little pamphlet. But I think we do a very poor job of educating people on things like even those little light blobs that they get when they point their camera on their cell phone towards a bright light, and oh my God, it's a UFO. Well, suddenly you've got a whole bunch of reports of a lens flare.
Mhm.
They're very ignorant about that. Well, I mean, wait a
Yeah.
minute. You're calling it a UFO, but yet it sounds like a drone. Do you know that they make sounds with the rotors and stuff like that? Do you know that? Do we educate people on that kind of an aspect? And also, the other part of this is, I think a lot of people, I mean, that are flying these things are not necessarily in compliance with FAA rules, and maybe because they're ignorant about that. But but here's the other thing I was going to bring up, and that fact that if I took my drone and I set it up in the air at this point, how many people would potentially around that whole area within maybe like what, maybe like 1 mile or something like that, and maybe in a populated, how many people would see that individually report it, and suddenly you've now met, let's say 30 people now are now reporting an object. Well, wait a minute, it's not 30 objects, it's one object seen by 30 people,
Mhm. Right.
right?
Yep.
And the
Yeah.
fact that you have witnesses out there now misidentifying aircraft and helicopters as drones, going back to Matthew's point, they're ignorant about the fact that that distance and that size does matter, right? An aircraft is rather large, right? But yet they're calling that a drone, and we've now seen like 3 times the number of people that are taking their laser pointers, which is against the law, and now flashing it at a pilot in an airplane, and that's grossly wrong. So people are very ignorant about what's up in the skies, and we need to do a better job of educating them.
Yeah, I respect these points, and as I first saw this take off, I was reluctant, very reluctant, to assume that this was UFO UAP, and a lot of folks jumped on that bandwagon. And there's a problem here. This is the ufology
Yeah,
has lost credibility as a field, and the phenomenon has lost respectability as worthy of research because of some of this kind of people piling on and other factors too. I mean, we don't know what elements would want to continue to obfuscate with continued things like this or
Well, I don't think
manipulation of public perception.
it never had credibility because the problem is the stigma and taboo caused by government agencies, like Rich said, saying nothing to see here. If you see something, you're crazy. And I think that it's hard to build credibility when you're fighting a headwind and an uphill battle where everyone's telling you you're crazy. Oh, and by the way, I apologize. I'm even more in the dark now. I had to move rooms because my laptop was at 10%, and if I didn't plug into an outlet, you would have lost me. So, but now I'm charging, so I'm good. But I had to run to another room where
No
I could
worries.
get my
You're a
charger.
mystery
Sorry
physicist.
about
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, anything else on the drone situation just to close up? Because I don't want people to also feel like it's all mass hysteria and misidentification either.
No, I think
I
there was a
mean,
seed of truth, like I said earlier, and I think Rich said the same thing. I think it probably started potentially with a sighting of something legitimately anomalous, but then I think it quickly ballooned and spiraled out of control.
yeah, and you know, words matter. Okay, so what you had was, let's go back and look at the fact that we've had a large number of cases that are around like military bases. If you look at Langley, that happened back in the December timeframe of last year, right? So you had a situation where, not, I'm sorry, the year before, because it was the end of 2023. But the point that I'm trying to get at was you had a large number of things, and the media was reporting that it's over Langley Air Force Base. Well, there's a difference between the word over, around, and near. And these things were not.
lost audio.
I can't hear
Sorry,
anything.
gentlemen, I lost. Okay. I think we lost your mic, Rich.
Can you hear me
Try to
still?
get that back. Okay. Oh, set up.
Can you still hear me?
Let me just get my earbud. All right, working on the audio here.
Can you still hear me? No, I can't hear you, Rich.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. I don't know what happened.
Okay.
My video goes out, my audio goes out. What's going on?
There we
Let me
go. We got you. We're back.
Am I back?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Okay,
Did,
so my just big point there was words matter. So if you're reporting it's over, or around, or near, that there's a distinguishing aspect about that, right? And we have a lot of reports where they're saying over this, they're over that. They're not. They're around, or they're near, and
mhm.
and so I think we need to be concerned about that. Plus, I'm also engaged in the DoD, working there, and we're putting in drone busters to be able to knock them out of the sky. And so, if you look at Parsippany, the gentleman had a drone where he was going after another drone, and that's another thing. People were actually sending up drones to go look for drone, right? So
Right.
so his drone gets knocked out of the air. It was probably knocked out of the air by a drone buster that we have, that we actually engaged, and we knock him out of the sky, right? And so, I mean, yeah, okay, we're trying to do countermeasures and stuff like that, and that's very important for us, and I encourage that. But again, that let's say I'm flying my drone. Do I want somebody to now think that that's what it is, and for the police to come and shoot it, or or to knock it out of the sky? I'm doing it legally, by the way. I mean, so we have to figure all that stuff out with drones.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a lot in this one, and this is not just in the U.S. or in the last year, right? It's internationally. It's over the last 2 years, and it's in the UK. It's over nuclear armed facilities, and there are some anomalous behaviors, or at least phenomenal performance capabilities being reported. So much to look at there. I want to move on now and just, if we can, talk about the path forward for UAP research. How do you both see this continuing into the new year under a new political administration, in a new political climate in the United States, at least? What's the path forward?
Well, I think you need people like David Grush and Carl Nell. I think hopefully engaging in some formal way, being included in administration and driving disclosure forward. You need to get rid of legacy gatekeeper people, like fire them. So if it is true that we know more than we're saying, and there's reverse engineering and there's non-human intelligence craft, then whoever has been hiding that from the American people and from the world needs to be fired. So it's not only illegal in the United States, but I'd say it's a crime against humanity to keep the truth from us. So those kinds of, like, again, I have no proof, right? Because all hearsay, but we need to, if people like that exist who are like elderly gatekeepers, like if the cigarette smoking man from the X-Files is a real person, these people, they need to be fired. They need to be moved out of the way. And we need people, like I said, like David Grush and Carl Nell, and moving forward and getting things declassified if there is things to declassify. Because, like I said, I'm not convinced we know. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not convinced we know as much as conspiracy theorists claim that we know has happened. And I'd love to be proven wrong. I want to see physical evidence and declassified documents and things like that. Earlier, Reed, you asked about technology. Does the government have better technology to get better data? Probably, but the thing, and so they probably classify the juiciest stuff. But here's the thing: is technology improves across all sectors, right? So my iPhone, right, can take some pretty damn good photos and video. If my iPhone fell into a time machine and appeared in the 1980s, it would be immediately seized and classified by the US government and be like, what the hell is this, right? Immediately, let's try to weaponize this. And so I think that our current technology for civilians is light years ahead of the top secret best military technology of the 80s, 70s, 60s, and so I think that if there is something to disclose, if disclosure doesn't happen, isn't from the government, it's going to be forced. This is one of the extra papers I wrote that maybe we'll get to a later read about catastrophic disclosure or accidental disclosure, because we've all got very powerful tools with us that can find evidence in a way that wasn't possible 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yes. And just to call out, there is conversation about a senior advisor on UAP at the
hmm
executive level,
And I threw
directly to the
out some
president.
example names. Yeah.
Yeah,
Say again,
I would
Matthew?
agree. Those both of those gentlemen you mentioned are people that I would recommend as well. I think that ultimately it's a situation where we do need someone at a very executive level tied to the president or something like that with a focus on this particular aspect of the phenomena that could help to drive the overall all government kind of thing. But here's another point. I want them to get. I want them to engage. Academia. I want them to engage, and especially academia from the standpoint of helping to build, and contribute in developing plans or strategies or various other things going forward with how we would do this. I think it is a global phenomena. So at some point, you have to engage the global community and get them involved. And then, you have the problem with the transparency, and you need to fix the transparency issues. You got to quit over classifying this stuff, and potentially allowing for researchers who can do something with it that may not be in the Defense Department, but not might be outside of that. So again, and then you have the problem of building trust because there's so much distrust with the entire government that if you're going to run this, then you have to build a trust level up, and it's got to be in your face. It's got to be with everybody, and it's got to be that you, again, going back to the fact you're educating the public and getting and rebuilding that trust and that open and that transparency. So it's a huge, complex problem that you have to work with. And I think
Mhm.
that very talented people have to go after this. And you working in the government, yeah, you can have situations where people are hiding stuff. And they need to come forward. I think that getting efficiencies and effectiveness in government is a good thing. I think that there's a lot of waste out there. I think you can ultimately try to do something with that. But again, it's like having a focus that you're going to put on this thing, and then having the necessary structures in place to be able to make it a reality. Because we need answers, and we need to have
Mhm.
people that can engage in it. It would be nice if we had one database as opposed to a gazillion of them. It would be nice if we had some sort of a means of using things like AI and stuff like that against those databases to help us out. It would be nice if we had, all the wonderful technology that NASA and the government can get, because then you don't have to go rebuy it. If you could get that engaged to the point where you could now have that you've already spent for that stuff and have that technology helping you out. And I believe that realistically, if you had all that together within a very short time, you could get a lot of answers that we drag
Mhm.
on, and we deal with obstruction mostly, you know,
Yep.
you know,
Right.
and lack of cooperation and everything else. So if you could overcome that, you could have a very short window, and you could probably learn a lot about this phenomena.
I agree, and in fact, I can put a number on it. This is going to be exact number of zeros. If you gave a scientist like me 0.00001% of the Defense Department's budget, we get some answers real fast.
Yep.
Guarantee you. Give that money to me and Kevin Knuth, we'll get you answers. We'll get that smoking gun you wanted earlier that I said doesn't even exist. Oh yeah, you give me 0.00001% of Defense Department's budget. That's a huge number. It sounds like a tiny. That's an enormous amount of money.
I
That's a
mean,
few hundred thousand
that's a
dollars.
great sales pitch, Matthew. And
Yeah,
come on, DoD, you can't even pass an audit. You
yeah,
can give up
yeah.
like
It's like
quadruple 1% of your
I mean
unknown missing
the
funds.
Defense Department's spare change on
Yep.
its nights on the DoD's nightstand could be enough to give scientists like me and Kevin what we need to get shit done on this finally.
Yep.
Great. And I mean, we're at a key moment, right? I mean, new administration seems to be some appetite, at least in both at the executive level and the cabinet picks to undertake this, to break open the deep state, to confront the secrecy
Yep.
apparatus. I think getting the right people in the right positions will be key because it's very likely that there are very powerful people who could step in and basically keep this, sweep it under the carpet once again, because there have been moments of seeming transparency and seeming, open dialogue that just they get suppressed. And So it's a
That's right.
tenuous moment I think we're in.
I mean, this has happened in cycles. Rich can tell you he's been around for a lot longer than me. And this is that there are cycles, and opportunities are missed. I want to speak to directly the point you just made, Reed. Is that I disagree with President-elect Trump on a lot of things, but there's one thing I agree on. He should use the Schedule F, trick, and get if it's true that there's a big conspiracy. Again, I'm not 100% convinced, but there's so many hints. But if there's some grand conspiracy and crash retrieval programs, you fire the bastards who have been lying for decades to the American people and saying there's no such thing. And they've been enabling all the skeptics and debunkers to be like, ha ha, see, the government said there's nothing to see there. Because if it is true that non-human intelligences exist out there, that is the greatest discovery in not just scientific history, but in human history. And it's unconscionable that there are people in these legacy programs or special access programs who have not told the world that aliens or whatever, interdimensional beings, whatever it is, if whatever label, that if those things exist and we've been lied to for years or decades, those people need to go. And so that's the one place I agree with President-elect Trump is use his, Schedule F, executive order trick, and you throw those bastards out. Do it right away. And you get in people, like I said, like Grush and Nell, and you get in people who want to push disclosure forward and get things declassified.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, we're fighting, we're on the playing field of old, but it seems to be a different team with better quarterback, better players, better strategy. And we have these individuals, like you mentioned, Dave Grush, Carl Nell, who have come out very transparently and have given information to the public or attempted to, and to Congress. And so we have a president or executive who seems to have the appetite to take it on. We have individuals with the expertise and the understanding of, the classification management system and all the problems that seem to be suppressing this. So let's get it done. Interesting stuff. I want to talk about catastrophic disclosure. Matthew, you wrote this paper. I actually have it on screen here, and I read it for the second time today. We can put that up. But take us through kind of the highlights of what you did here, because you kind of seem to be able to put some probability statements on the fact that disclosure could catastrophically occur at a citizen level, at least, due to certain technological trends.
That's right. So basically, I take the concept that skeptics are always going on and on about iPhones, and everyone's got an iPhone or Android or smartphone, and they all talk out of their butts without actually sitting down and doing any math. Okay, and so I decided I'm going to sit down and do the math and see. Okay, there's been proliferation of camera phones, so then I took I took crash rates of lots of assumptions to make. Assume some UAP are intelligent craft. Assume they're fallible and prone to crashes. But Grush has said this, under oath, under penalty of perjury, like in congressional setting. David Grush said, and so we can piece together between his congressional testimony, News Nation, and Joe Rogan and stuff. We can estimate a crash rate. And so if the crash rate claimed by individuals like David Grush is accurate, and I believe in the paper says something like approximately, this is just an order of magnitude estimate. It's known as a Fermi estimate. Not to be confused with the Fermi paradox. Same Fermi, Enrico Fermi. This is called Fermi estimate, where I don't care if the answer is 9 or 12. I just said, okay, let's say we have 10 crashes per century of non-human craft. I estimated, okay, when did smartphones with cameras come out? How long will it be before someone captures evidence of a crash of an actual non-human craft, assuming that such a thing exists? Again, that's an assumption at the beginning of the paper. And I estimate, and so one thing is that if the crash rate is too high, we can debunk that. Because we can say, oh, they would have captured it already. We've had smartphones already. But using the smartphone proliferation statistics and using statistics that have actually been claimed by whistleblowers like Grush, I estimate that we've got until roughly the 2030s, 2040s, but it's just an estimate before there's an actual like Roswell type crash in a populated area. Someone busts out their phone and it is too late. That's on TikTok, that's on YouTube, and yeah, people will think it's fake, it's CGI. But again, we have software, because it's always a race. We have software for fakery and for checking as well. As we were saying
Mhm.
earlier. And if you
And
have
for
more than
detecting
one
fakery,
witness,
AI can be successful at detecting AI.
exactly. But even more important point to make is, the more witnesses you have, or one witness just from different angles, it becomes exponentially harder for AI to get all the number of fingers right and the shadows right and all these things. Just gets really, really hard to fake that. And so what I was looking for is literally, I mean, I didn't put it in these words in the paper, of course, but we're talking literally like flying saucer in your backyard with like gray aliens like climbing out of it, and you got it on your damn phone and you send it. Like, the military can't sweep in. It's too late, because it's the
Mhm.
21st century. You get it on TikTok, you get it on YouTube. There is no going back. The cat's out of the bag, the genie's out of the bottle. And what's really beautiful is my paper is agnostic, it's generic. If catastrophic disclosure doesn't happen soon, then we can use that to set limits on what a crash rate really could be, including as a function of time. You can use the math, the examples I give in the paper, to either prove or disprove. It's general. Math is general. It doesn't have a political agenda. It's just math. It's just equations. So you can, for example, use what I say in the paper to calculate how many Bigfoot there are in America. You can use the same equations to estimate and claim either Bigfoot doesn't exist or the population is some teeny, teeny, tiny number, because why hasn't someone captured Bigfoot on their smartphone yet? And so it's very, very powerful, I think, to look at the math and see, based on population density of smartphone ownership with cameras, how long would it take, if NHI are real, if they have craft and those crash can craft, and if those craft can crash. And I estimate that if David Grush's claim is correct of a crash rate, we're looking at probably 2030s or 40s, assuming again that the crash rate is constant. Because that's one thing is I need to stress with my paper, is I've also gotten a lot of criticisms. Oh, you didn't consider this factor or that factor, or the human psychological factor of, like, you will freeze in the moment. And I'm like, you know what? You're right. But guess what? It's better than doing nothing. It's better
Mhm.
than not writing the paper at all. I'm like, why don't you sit your butt down, write a paper where you criticize my paper, but nobody does. I'm like, I even wrote in my paper, I'm like, future authors should expand on this work. People should take it and expand on it. You don't like my
Mhm.
assumptions, then change it and rerun my simulation code, which I provide for download with the paper. I predict that nobody will even bother compiling my code or trying to run it. I hope I'm wrong. But there's also, my paper is one of many. SCU has been publishing papers up the wazoo for years that nobody reads, and they need to read them, especially politicians. So earlier you're talking about intent. Somebody should sit down finally and read the intentions paper that was led by SCU member Larry Hancock. It's a free PDF you download on their website. Why is nobody reading any of the
Mhm.
serious attempts, both by scientists and engineers as well as by citizen scientists, to address some of these questions? Are they perfect? Is my paper perfect? Is Larry Hancock's study perfect? No. But what they are beginnings of a serious quantitative conversation, where in the past we were just sitting on our armchairs pulling stuff out of our asses. Let's stop pulling stuff out of our asses and actually start making
Tight.
assumptions and studying this.
Yeah, what is that? Is it a cognitive barrier? Is it a political will? Is it sobriety? Is it the disinformation, the ridicule factor that just
It's
keeps
it's
us, yeah,
ridicule and
rich?
also lack of money. We're all volunteers working on our free time. Nobody's paying Rich to work on this. Nobody's paying me to work on this. I would love to have a government grant, like I said, at 0.00001% Defense Department budget, to look at this full time as a PhD scientist. Imagine how much progress would be made if you had 1, 5, 10, more than that, PhD scientists and engineers across different fields, not just physics, actually whose only job was to study UFOs. Imagine how vast progress would be made, and in an open, unclassified way, in an open science way, where we publish our findings for the general public in peer-reviewed papers and PDFs on their website like SCU does. These are the beginnings right here.
Yeah.
And it's not the first beginning, because like you said, it goes in waves. Whatever happened to JUFOs, to Hynek's journal? See, the thing is these things go in waves, and then for some reason, maybe the ridicule factor, like you were saying, Reed, or lack of funding, these die, and then more years and decades pass, and then we reboot again the attempt to make progress in this field.
I point this out to a lot of different people that I get on shows and stuff with. Are you aware of the fact that there's probably 700,000 documents that have been released by FOIAs that are on sites that all deal with the phenomena that we're calling UFOs? And then the other point that I'm trying to get at is that how often do you think that those things get read? They don't get read at all. And then you have this thing where you're doing the National Defense Authorization Act, where you're trying to get all these records from the government organizations to go to NARA, and then NARA is supposed to put them up on sites. How many of those documents do you think that are actually going to get read by anybody? The problem is that you have a cultural or a society out there that largely, for the most part, has maybe just a cursory interest in this phenomena, or not interested in the phenomena at all. There's a lot of politicians that are not interested in this at all. There's a lot of them that have religious issues with it because they think that it's demons and various other things. So their personal beliefs get engaged in this. Then you have some people that say, well, I'll believe it when I see evidence. Then you have the people that where I say that I'll believe it. I believe it wholeheartedly. And then you have the people that reject it in its entirety. And then you have the people who are not the critical thinking people that already have turned it into a conspiracy theory. So those are the kinds of aspects you run across in the society that we got and that we're living in. And by the way, that society is also represented by our Congress people who all have these different opinions and beliefs and stuff like that. So are you ever, I always point out, how are you going to define success when it comes to UFO UAP disclosure or whatever like that, and getting the society to buy it? I mean, how do you define that? Especially when you've got all these people. I've got family members that totally reject anything that I'm doing. They're not even interested. They could have a UFO overhead. They just dismiss it and let it go on with their business. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is, how do you define success here in terms of getting, what's our goal here? Getting
It's a great question.
getting
Right.
what? The scientists engaged? The
I
politicians? How about the
Right.
religions? How about the different countries around the planet that don't have an interest in this at all?
Right.
And
I mean, could
that's what we
could
experienced when
disclosure
we.
be prompted at the societal level such that government could confirm instead of disclose?
Yeah,
Lower the pain threshold to
and
some
then
degree.
let me hit you another thing. Who would you believe is the best whatever person or organization to make that disclosure and saying they're here? Who would you trust? Is it Trump? Is it the Pope? Is it the UN? Who do you go to make this that where you're going to find an entire planet buying into it?
I don't think that question has one answer,
It
because
doesn't.
even though truth is not by majority, I do think that a majority will be helpful. For example, President of the United States comes out and says it, and Putin, and
Mhm.
and I'm not going to pronounce his name right, President of
Xi
China.
Jinping.
And if multiple start, so again, truth is not by majority. Let's be careful. But I think that more people would be helpful. But again, it's not going to convince Neil deGrasse Tyson and Mick West. Not that I care what what like non-scientists think necessarily, but
Right.
basically, I think that you need to I want to be shipped a piece of a craft to study, to be like, oh yes, this is extraterrestrial. So like I think different people define success differently, Rich. But the one like step zero success would be for me would be like the government. I'm allowed to apply to the government for funding to work on UFOs, and I get it. That would be a good first step, in my opinion. It's not maybe what everyone would would use, but that's like step zero for me. It's before step one even.
Step function in this,
Yeah,
in how
there is.
society would be triggered.
Yeah,
It wouldn't be all at once. Don't need 51% of the world, but even 5% of the world.
right.
But also in some ways we've had success. I think it was an SCU conference where Colonel Alexander said Colonel John Alexander said something like, "Well, what disclosure already happened? What's wrong with all of you?" And at first I was like, oh ha ha, that's cute. But then you look into it. I mean, there are stories that nobody's talking about. Like there's this guy Tony Bergalia who filed the Freedom of Information Act for, hey, are there any technologies reverse engineered from UFOs? And guess what? He got an answer. Why isn't that covered by the mainstream media? He got a 154 page document that talks about like metamaterials and nitinol and cloaking, where like that's an admission. It's almost like they didn't come out and say, the Pentagon didn't come out and say this is alien technology, but they literally responded to a request for alien technology with a 154-page document that lists a whole bunch of technologies. So it's kind of like pleading the Fifth Amendment when you're guilty. Everybody knows you're guilty, but legally no, because you pleaded the Fifth Amendment. Everybody knows you're guilty. You pleaded the Fifth Amendment, so you don't have to say you're guilty and self-incriminate. But we all know you're guilty because you pleaded the Fifth. However, legally you're not guilty. And it's the same thing with some of these FOIA requests that have been answered. The Pentagon has almost said, aliens are real, we have reverse engineers craft, but legally they've not said that. So it's really weird. But if you dig
Yeah.
into some of these cases where people have had successful FOIA requests answered, it's like, the Pentagon has pretty much admitted everything, Grush and Nell has been saying, but like, legally they haven't, but they kind of have.
Right. I mean, there's indications there's been efforts to get the public onboarded or at least acclimated to certain realities for many, many, many years.
Well,
I mean, is that part
nobody's
of
going
it?
to care. That's the other thing, is nobody's going to care. I worry about. I think the ship has already sailed for the like ufologist wet dream of disclosure of like, and we'll all get on board. I think that ship has sailed, because if tomorrow like the president holds a press conference and says NHI are real and we have craft, nobody would believe it. People would go nuts. The internet would explode with conspiracy theories of the other kind now. They'd be like, oh, aliens are fake. It's made up to distract from the economy, man. Like there would just be conspiracy theories in the other direction now, saying, oh, it's made up to distract from Ukraine, from real world problems. So honestly, like I said earlier, there is no more smoking gun. That ship has gone. It has sailed. We are in an era where literally, like Rich said, what do you want? Trump could get on TV, say it's real. People be like, oh yeah, Trump. Who believes Donald Trump? He's a moron. You would have immediately, no matter what happens, now it's too late. It's too late to convince the majority of people. The best we can do, in my opinion, right now is convince the majority of scientists in academia so that we can start making some progress scientifically. But you're never going to convince the general public now that believes in, doesn't believe in climate change and believes in Israeli space lasers and all kinds of nonsense. Like, you're not going to convince the flat earthers and all the crazies on the internet. You never
Right.
will. It is too late. We no longer have a society now where everybody watches ABC or NBC. Like during the Cold War, now everyone sits down in their echo chamber on YouTube or TikTok and just reinforces what they already believe. Nobody is willing to step outside their comfort zone and engage with ideas that are outside of their current world paradigm.
They're into
Right.
the confirmation bias. They want to be
Exactly.
confirmed.
Confirmation
Yeah.
bias. Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this a lot. How does a world, let's just imagine, thought experiment, we're one world in an ecosystem of worlds, and we're not the least advanced, we're certainly not the most advanced, and we're in some sort of like step function entrance into that ecosystem, ratcheting closer to some acknowledgement of it. It's in our space in the sense of craft from that environment. How does a world come to recognize its environment and reconcile that ontologically, religiously, and it could be enormously complex and messy. It might take hundreds of years. It might lead to a global systemic collapse, and then out of that is birthed a more coherent notion of human identity and human place in the universe. I don't think it'll be a linear journey. I think there is some potential in the modern, given, yes, technology, AI, possible efforts for citizen data collection, coupled with a willing political apparatus, could just break the glass, right? And just crack the facade enough that it cannot be resealed, that the toothpaste, once out of the tube, can't just dry up and blow away. Like, it's out in a way that it can't be stuffed back in, and it's too biotic to stop. So I think there is some hope there. That might be the optimistic. But maybe it takes hundreds of years for a species to recognize its place.
I I want somebody, if it's true that there's crash retrieval programs and there's actually non-human intelligence, I want somebody to have the, like, I'm not saying I would have this, but someone has the courage and the moral fortitude to break the law and just smuggle out, give me one goddamn piece of a flying saucer that's clearly extraterrestrial. Just smuggle it out. I've heard claims, Kevin Knuth tells me about, there are execution clauses in NDAs. I'm sorry, that's illegal. That's
Mhm.
unconstitutional. An execution clause? Excuse me? How is that legal? Why aren't lawyers all up on this? Danny Sheehan should be up on this. Like, what execution clause? Like, all it takes is
Right.
one person who's not afraid to be a martyr. But the problem is, I'm sure they have all kinds of psychological testing for people. It's got to have one person who slips through, slips a piece of a ship, or I
Yeah.
don't care, an alien
Well,
fingernail in
people
their
also have
work,
they
and
have
ships it
children
to
and
ships it to rich.
extended relational networks.
Yeah.
My broadcast team is nodding their heads right now, Matthew. They want to see the shipped piece of metamaterial in
Yeah.
your office.
I mean, I just
I
want to get, and but then what'll happen? Then there's the next roadblock. Is then nobody will publish the results. Oh, that's fake. How do
Yeah,
we know that
that's
result
true.
is real? Then you've got editors at journals who say that's fake, and so then you've got the gatekeepers of science and academia who will say, "Oh, you just made that up. You don't have any piece." I'm like, "But it's right here." Yeah, but we don't believe your test results on it. It's
Mhm.
like you just, the goalposts will keep moving. And so I think that what's going to happen is, I think first you need cracks in the glass, like you were saying. There's not just going to be one moment of disclosure. It's going to be like, even if tomorrow, like I said, the president of the United States said, "Hey, everybody, aliens are real," that still won't be good enough for most people. They won't believe it. They'll say that's
Got a crack.
nonsense, you made it up. And so, like, we're at a point where we need multiple threads going, multiple hammers going at that glass from different angles
Yeah,
in order to,
Mhm.
to, to break through.
agree
Yeah,
completely.
and I wouldn't overlook the potential of catastrophic disclosure coming from a non-human source. I mean, we don't know the intent. If there is an entity behind these craft, what that intent would be and what their timeline is, how they might react to us.
Hmm.
I'd like to turn to some questions now. I know we're getting toward the end of the show, and we were going to get into ETH, extraterrestrial hypothesis, and NHI, and maybe get some thoughts at the end there, but we might have to make that part two, which I think is a very good part two. So let me get a question or two on screen. Let's put this up. All right. So while military-sponsored research operates in secrecy, what, in your opinion, has been the single most significant breakthrough discovery toward understanding the phenomena within the wider scientific community? I can, whoever wants to take it.
I,
I'll be perfectly honest with you. I'm not aware of military-sponsored research that's been put out into the public domain. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of like, various kinds of committees that have been held, or,
And I think this is not
hearing.
necessarily a military-sponsored research discovery, but in light of that happens in secrecy, we think, what in the public is the most significant discovery?
Well, I'd be hard pressed to be able to give you an example of any one specific thing. I think that, from what I have seen, there's more from the public an acceptance that there might be something to it when we had the 2017 announcements in the Wall Street or the New York Times. And I think that what I saw was a fundamental shift in saying that the government was looking at something and that they've now started to accept it. And so I think that ultimately the research that we've been doing and trying to get out, I think is all very, very good information, but I'm not sure that the public has that, awareness about what we're publishing. So, I mean, going back to it, I'd be hard pressed to answer that being like one specific thing that the general public jumps out and accepts. So, I
Right.
mean,
Yeah,
Matthew, do you have a
yeah.
perception
From
of
my
that?
from my perspective, but again, I'll agree with Rich. The most important breakthroughs have been getting. It hasn't been one thing. They were all near simultaneous. Is getting multiple papers published, like Galileo Project publishing papers, but again, that nobody's reading, especially not in the general public. So, do any of these papers, like the UAPX paper, do we have smoking gun evidence? No, but we have created important cracks in the stigma and the taboo that was preventing publication. I think this is really important. We are now, and for example, on UAPX, we're on the verge of might be getting our first paper published in a major, high-impact, peer-reviewed journal. And again, it's all roughly simultaneous, because Galileo Project did already, and other groups. So like we're starting to break through and getting papers, scientific papers published, just on like methodology and control data. Nothing, Gary Nolan's published papers, like in Journal on Progress in Aerospace. Was it a smoking gun evidence? No, but he was establishing, controls and methodology and things like that. But that's how you start. But I think the questioner was asking about like also military sponsored research that was a secret that then we wouldn't know about. Rich, that's what they were saying, is like if there's secret stuff, then of course we don't know about that. So that part's not in the open.
Correct.
Let's go to this. Let's go to the second question. Regarding the psi aspect of the unidentified and contact phenomenon, psychological impacts have been acknowledged, though it was seized on to discredit experiencers. Yet there is so much that can be learned. I'm not seeing a question in this, more of a comment.
Um, I guess so as an investigator, all the many thousands and thousands of cases that we've studied, at least, and also the cases, the well over 1,000 cases that I personally investigated on, I never ran into anything that was actually what I would call psi phenomena in any of the investigations that I did. So for me, it's a situation where this whole thing about psi phenomena is a relatively new thing that I never found when I did any kind of actual investigations face to face with witnesses after their events. And so I'm not sure if that's a legitimate, that there's actually enough evidence for that. But I mean, so there's people that believe it. But what I'm saying to you is when I'm there on the scene right after these things happen, there's nothing about any aspect of that they're coming forward with that leads me to believe that it was psi phenomena was associated at all. Now, let me back up. A lot of people have transpersonal kinds of experiences that happen as a result of having their sightings. And then they may have, some sort of experiences that are post that I would have not been able to have they didn't come back and tell me about, right? So I'm not sure that I can equate that, but it's not been in my experience. I will also say that, and I've also had a strong interest in NDEs. My wife had an NDE, for example, if not near death experience, right? And there are certain aspects of that where, again, a lot of these people who have these things, it changes them personally to now become either more spiritual or more in touch with things that typically you'd look at and say would be psi phenomena, right? Or some paranormal aspect that falls outside of it. Again, it's not been it doesn't fall into typical UFO research. Uh, we don't even ask the right questions because guess what? The questions we pose to them are things that are about a craft. going back to your
Mhm.
point. We're
Yeah, I
looking
think there are a
for,
number of organizations collecting data on the experience side, the encounter, and the characteristics
well,
of the encounter and the
yeah.
potential entity.
Yeah. So a lot of those are the experiencer side of the house. What I'm saying to you is, I'm, you know, we haven't really gotten engaged as an organization in SU to go out and look for anything related to experiencers. Why don't we do that? Because guess what? It's not a very well disciplined field of research. And that is that, what I experienced in even looking at experiencers is, how do I deal with the psychology? I'm not trained to be a psychologist. How do we deal with the medical aspects associated with that? We don't have that. We don't have insurance to be able to go and tell people, go over to this doctor and
Sure.
be looked at, or go to this psychologist and get, some sort of a. So we don't have those things in place to truly properly study that. What we do have is a variety of volunteers who are willing to engage that, who are now looking at cases and starting to come up with some sort of an understanding about psi phenomena, and allegedly people who have had, encounters like, abducted, claims of abduction or various other things. And that's all well and good, but we haven't focused, and I'm sure that Matthew hasn't focused on that. I haven't focused on it, and neither has a large number of us that are looking at the actual objects. So I'm not
Mhm.
prepared to answer the psi
No
aspects, and I
worries.
think
Yeah, we're gonna have on the show people from various organizations, maybe UAP Med or Unhidden, MUFON ERT. Abductions are definitely not all and
yeah,
well for those who have
I-
encountered them, but we
just like
will.
if just like if you asked me about Bigfoot, I would refer you to Bigfoot people, because I don't study that. I'm
I,
not going to
Yep.
study that.
I've got a
Fair
great
enough.
deal to say about this, and I'm going to anger the questioner and anger a lot of your viewers probably, but I agree a lot with what Rich said. I want to separate the UFO and sci stuff to keep getting lopped together. And I've heard all the people claim, oh, they're inseparable, inseparable, you got to study them together. I strongly push back on that, and here's why. Because if all these things are real, society, especially scientists, can only handle so many red pills at once. So if, let's say, the psi and the UFO are real, if you're going to shove all of that in now all at once, you're going to turn off all the most open-minded, even scientists, and we're going to make no progress again. Okay, so the problem is that at least with UFOs, you have a hypothesis like the extraterrestrial hypothesis that we can hang a hat on. That's physical. It's nuts and bolts spaceships. There's no magic. There's no paranormal. And and believe me, I've listened to all the podcasts and read the books and watched the YouTube videos and heard the people say, oh, you cannot separate UFOs and paranormal. You will make no progress. It's so dangerous. Don't separate them. I strongly push back against that because I think that this is a very, very false logic. I'll give you an example. So let's say I'm wrong. And let's say UFOs and psi phenomena, oh, they're inseparable, they're intimately related. Does that mean I'm forbidden from studying one without also studying the other? False. Here's an example. Let's say there is a soul that is inseparable from the human body except through death. That is an incredibly important aspect of being human, is you have a body and a soul. Let's say I study disease, and let's say I study the common cold. Do I care what's happening to your soul if you have a cold in your body? You see what I'm saying? That even if two things are intimately related, nothing prevents me from saying, oh, I'm only going to study this aspect because I'm going to
Mhm.
specialize in that thing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And so when I say I'm studying nuts and bolts ships, I'm not claiming that I have a reductionist approach. What I'm saying is I'm going to take a modular approach. And most people think those two things are synonymous. That is false. That would be like saying I'm not allowed to use a computer without knowing all of computer programming and all about the microchips and how the RAM works. That's bullshit. And
Mhm.
similarly with UFOs, even if there is some of this psi and all that stuff, I don't agree with it, but let's say I'm wrong. Let's say that's intimately related. It's completely related. It's part of the same phenomenon. There's nothing wrong with breaking off a piece and saying I'm studying the nuts and bolts aspect. So to be clear, I am not propagating a stigma. To be clear, I'm all for people like, Dean Radin and Hal Puthoff looking into this, and I'm all for them being allowed to publish their papers. So even though I'm skeptical, I'm not a debunker. I'm open-minded. I'm willing to be convinced. Oh yeah, that guy's psychic. Look at the scientific evidence and the statistical proof. I'm all open-minded and ready to accept that, but I'm just not convinced from what I've seen. With UFOs, I'm totally convinced that there's at least some sort of physical and nuts and bolts aspect to this. So again, I know I'm going to anger the questioner and anger a lot of the viewers tonight and listeners, but I have a modular approach where I want to look at the physical science aspect. Let other people look at the sci stuff. I will not laugh at them. I will not ridicule them. If they convince me it's real, I am all for it because they've got an even worse stigma. Absolutely. I'm all for that being studied, but I think it's premature jumping the gun to tie them together. Also, a lot of what we call paranormal is really normal that hasn't been explained by science. So I worry that we jump to paranormal explanations too early because Arthur C. Clarke, he has this famous quote that sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So, experiencers claim that they have telepathy with great aliens, stuff like that. You would call that psi. I wouldn't call that psi or paranormal. That's probably some advanced technology that we just don't know how to replicate. I think we should stop jumping to magic and paranormal and supernatural, whatever you want to call it. I think that a lot of what's called psi phenomena are things that are real but are just not yet fully explained or understood. So I don't think we should label something as inexplicable just because it's not explicable today.
Did we answer that?
Thank you. Go ahead, Rich. Yeah. We should move on to the next question too.
Yeah, next question. I think ultimately it's a situation, like you said, if I have Bigfoot, I'm going to put it to somebody that wants to study Bigfoot. If I have somebody that has an abduction thing, I'm going to send it to somebody that does that. I don't do that. And so there's nothing wrong with it.
There's nothing wrong with that, even if Bigfoots are tied to, because some people have claimed hairy creatures and they think Bigfoot flies on UFOs. That's okay. Right. But it's okay still to be modular. Even if those two things are related, it's okay to have people who specialize. You should see how highly specialized physics and other disciplines have become. Now, it's true that one can over-specialize, but I think it's okay to say my specialty is X and someone else's specialty is Y. It's not a sin to specialize. And so I don't study psi phenomena. I have friends who do, and I want them to succeed. And I hope that they don't look down on me for saying, I'm just going to look at like the nuts and bolts ship thing. That's not the same thing as me laughing at them. It's just me saying, look, I'm a human being. I have a wife and 4 kids. I only have this much time. I have finite time. I'm only going to look at one aspect of the phenomenon, capital P, because I don't have time to follow up with every experiencer and psychic, alleged phenomenon stuff. I don't have time for that.
Right.
Wow. I mean, I have a wife and 1 kid, Matthew, so I can only imagine how little time you might have, especially given your professional life. But 2 things you said that I resonate with me a lot is, there's only so many red pills, society, and the different, domains of society, academia, government, what have you, the mainstream media can handle all at once. And we have great utility towards our ability to detect the nuts and bolts. Like the science is there. We actually can detect these craft. It's been demonstrated. We don't have the money to do it, or potentially, the scalability yet. But it also, in addition, is there a stepwise process to this? Where do we need to deal with the physical first, because it does potentially have physical risks, hazards, and then emerge or expand into a larger experience or framework for understanding reality that physicality of the phenomenon might suggest, versus all at once. Is there something first, then second, then third to deal with?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately a lot of people want to tie it to consciousness, and stuff like that, right? But now you're taking again something that's relatively unknown in itself, consciousness, or what that is, and you're trying to apply it and connect it to something else that's also an unknown. And then if you want to throw something else in, now you have all these unknowns trying to be connected, and it just doesn't get us anywhere, right? So I think ultimately, and I get asked about consciousness all the different times, but what am I supposed to do with that? People are having legitimate experiences. It's coming down and it's landing and it's creating an effect on the soil. that wasn't consciousness that did that. It was actually the soil that was being baked by something, right? I want to
Exactly.
study that.
Exactly. I totally
Yeah.
agree with Rich. Is everyone's always asking me, well, what about UAPs and consciousness? And God, I hate that question because I'm like, I'm sorry, I'm not a psychologist or a neurologist. If I tell you my idea, it's going to be wrong. I'll be talking out of my butt because
And you're a
I'm a
physicist, so be a
exactly.
physicist. I mean, I think
And again,
every
I'm not
domain, every type of person is
exactly.
called into this.
I am not claiming that aspect isn't real and isn't important. I'm just saying we need an interdisciplinary team. Have
Yeah.
somebody else study that and work with me. I don't have
Right.
time to study that. That's not my specialty. And don't go telling me, oh, they're inseparable, they're intimately connected. Bullshit. Look at my example of a human being who has a body and a soul, and you've got a cold or a flu. What the hell does that cold or flu have to do with your soul? Nothing. Just like what Rich just said, the UFO made a soil impression. What does that have to do with consciousness? Jack shit. And so maybe there was a consciousness aspect too, but that was separate. So I think that we should study these things, but we need an interdisciplinary team of scientists. You don't want a physicist doing psychology. You don't need a neurologist doing physics. That's not appropriate. You need to have
I'm pretty sure
collaboration.
by now the audience does not want you doing their psi research, Matthew.
Yeah, yeah,
They're very happy for you to do the physics side.
yeah. Just let me
No,
do the
but
physics.
I hear your impassioned call, and
Yeah.
I know there's a all at once kind of message, and it could get us thrown into loops. When
Yeah,
like I've advocated, if there is a physical alien visitor, 3 words, physical, alien, and visitor, if that
yeah,
needs to be dealt with on a different time
yes,
scale and to a different degree now than the existence of a super consciousness in the universe, which may
exactly.
also be indicated.
Which may also be real, but this is not hypothetical for me. I have personal stories. I know open-minded colleagues who are like UFOs. They want to get into it, and then they were told, "Oh, that's inseparable from psi and paranormal and Bigfoot," and they go, "Fuck that shit," and they walk away. And we need those people to not walk away because we need as many brilliant minds working the problem. So even if all that other stuff is real, I don't want a colleague walking away who's like, "Oh yeah, I'm interested. It could be aliens," and then I say sigh, and they're like, "Goodbye."
Mm,
I don't want them leaving. I want more people working on the problem. But people get
mm,
turned off when you throw all the red pills at them at once. They get turned off and they walk away. And then what's going to
yeah.
happen is we're going to have another 80 years of no progress. That's what's
Right.
going to happen.
I hear that frustration, and I have a lot of conversations with a lot of normal average people out there about this issue, and I don't bring up consciousness or things that would rock their religious sense of reality or their personal sense of human identity. Like, I do start with the potential of exoplanets, and that the universe gave rise to life on Earth and sentient life here. Why not there? And also, in very hostile environments on this Earth has life arisen. Why not out? I start in that way, and people can engage and they can walk right into this reality. And so, yeah, if we're throwing it all at the kitchen sink at them all at once, and people disassociate, that's a problem. Gentlemen, I want to move on to 2 more questions. These are somewhat technical. What are the speaker's thoughts on a UAP detection and tracking strategy with U.S. Strategic Command as the proponent and each geographic command responsible for its own areas, much like missile defense, with NORTHCOM in a homeland defense role? I hope you know what those acronyms
Well,
mean,
Rich
because
yeah.
I
does.
don't fully.
Well, I do because I work in the DoD. But I mean, ultimately, it's a situation where I think that ultimately all of our sensors and tracking tools that we've got and we've put in place could definitely benefit if we could ever fuse that data together and actually get some intelligence from it. So, for example, I mean, and I really think that the Defense Department, who has that wonderful budget that of course, Matthew would like to get the 0.00001, percent of that. That we've already invested a lot in those kind of like high degree those incredible pieces of equipment, some of which are like millions of dollars in terms of their cost to be able to get. But if you ever had all those different sensors and various other things that could be calibrated and tuned to being able to collect information and data, think about it. Think about satellites we've got, the satellites we've got. If we could have that to be able to help us out with the study of this phenomena, it would be very, very beneficial for us to have that and to bring that together. And you would need maybe organizations like, Northcom or some of the other organizations to help bring that picture together and fuse that. And they've got defense people that can help you to do that because that's their jobs. They fuse data and collect data, and that all comes together. And so the more we can do that, and I think the panel that was held was very much on point in the sense that you need curated data. In other words, you need to have data that's actually been looked at and evaluated and scrubbed, because data is, bad data can be bad data, and you want good data, right? And so ultimately, bringing that together and having it all very helpful would be extremely beneficial for the study. So if you could have, for example, let's say you've got those drones up there, right, or those objects over New Jersey, right? Can you imagine what it would be like if you had aircraft and ground sensors and everything else, and including satellites that you could come to play with that, bring all that wonderful data, and you could see that whole thing happen, and you'd be able to bring that together and give you a better understanding? That's what we want.
Mm-hmm.
We want all those different sensors to be able to help us out to collect data and stuff like that. So we need to look at how would we do that, and a lot of data needs a lot of time to go through and scrub it. So you'd have to know, maybe like it might be that my cell phone, going back to the point here. So I get alert that there's a UFO activity in my area. I now got multiple cell phones going up there, and I'm taking photos of it from different angles. Now I can do that trig that we talked about, right? At the same time, if I had other kinds of things like police with certain kinds of things, drones and everything, if I could alert that whole group of people, think about what that would be.
Yeah, I talked to
Right.
Mitch Randall in the last episode about Project Skywatch and this kind of multi-sensor with cell phone imagery and yeah, eyewitness as well.
Yeah.
Mitch, Rich, while I have you here, I'm going to ask the second question because I think you're the best. It also comes from Huntsville, where I believe you are located. So, what are the speaker's thoughts on specifically inserting UAP into the National Intelligence Priorities Framework with well-defined deliverables to the ODNI, Defense Intelligence Enterprise, and the DoD's Geographic Combatant Commands?
Well, I think that's where, I'll be honest with you, going back to the fact that we need that leadership at a high level to be able to fuse together all that wonderful information and help us to do that. So, yeah, we need a national science intelligence framework to be able to help us to do that, to bring that information forward to an executive level, by the way, to be able to now talk to the executive level of our government. At the same time, being able to give that information over to our congressional people. And it's going to be extremely beneficial for carrying the political aspect of this forward. And we need that political support to be able to get this phenomenon to moving forward. And so, you want your leadership to be able to have the best decisions about this phenomena. Is it a threat, for example, or is it not a threat? Do we see anything about, the concerns about drones that are elevating? Well, maybe what happens if there's a UFO flap in a given area, our UAP, right? So, I mean, wouldn't we want to know about that? Is it always about the fact that they're hanging around our military ranges? Well, we want to know about that. So again, you want to be able to bring that all together and put that into a national level, an intelligence structure or something of that nature to help bring that information forward to key leadership to be able to know what to do with it and how to respond. We don't want to have it. We don't want to go through this embarrassing thing again about having Chinese balloons going across our country. And oh, by the way, oops, we basically had NORAD not turn to the right channel or blocking that stuff out when it's just because it's slow moving. Well, excuse me, UAP can be slow moving too, right? So I mean, come on. Let's look at this and get those filters put the right way. Let's calibrate the equipment the way we need it to be, and let's start looking at that stuff, because guess what? It's here. It's
Look,
been here.
I Rich anticipated something I wanted to say almost exactly just a moment ago. Because, yeah, I think if I was an American adversary, like Russia, China, Iran, oh, you bet I would be capitalizing on the stigma against UFOs and the taboo. I would be building shit that's shaped like flying saucers and triangles and be like, oh, it's a UFO, and sending spy stuff over here and just saying, oh, it's a UFO. And then you'd have people afraid to report it because people are afraid of being, oh, that one guy. Remember Kevin Day, one of the co-founders of UAPX with Gary Verese. Like, remember what happened to him and how people laughed and like, oh, little green men, and ruined his life and ruined his career. If I was Russia, China, I would study that and be like, okay. So if somebody reports a UFO, their career is ruined. Excellent. I would build my spy crap to look exactly like traditional flying saucers and UFOs. And so like Rich's thing with the Chinese spy balloon, that is spot on. You bet your ass the Chinese are studying what we're doing wrong. And they're like, oh, look, they're anti-UFO, so we will disguise our stuff. That's exactly what an adversary would do. So this is our stigma, especially the U.S. government, the taboo against UFOs is a national security threat because human actors can slip under the radar. That's a pun. Literally slip under the radar, as Rich just said, by going under the filters for size, velocity, and things like that. They can literally slip under the radar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. With anomalous health disorders, or Havana syndrome as well.
Exactly.
If that's a taboo, right? And if there's a direct energy microwave weapon that's deployable.
Exactly. Stop making fun of people. Stop gaslighting them, and start telling the truth.
Let me put on my defense hat, because let's go back to the drone thing for a minute. So if I am a bad actor and I go take my drone out and I go over and I choose to break the FAA rules and fly around Redstone Arsenal, right, with my drone. Number one, I could do that, and I could share any kind of intelligence that I've got potentially with my, country that I'm a bad actor with, right? How can you possibly make a statement from the government saying that you know what the intent of that drone was, and you knew that the operator was not foreign, or that this was not a foreign drone? Excuse me? How do you know that?
Mm-hmm.
We've already had encounters where people are using drones that are actually like, sending this information back to other countries. That's already happened. So, and
there's a scare right now about social apps that are sending user data back to other countries.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So if there's an ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance activity going on, and we can dismiss it day one, that's a red flag.
We have to be aware that those actors are out there, and they can utilize the UFO or the UAP or whatever you want to call it. They can use that to their advantage and be applying that on the American public to obviously create confusion or anything else that we got. And look how confused we are about the drones, right? So, bottom line was UAPs would do the same thing. We would be very confused about that. And what we need to be is better understanding how to discriminate the good, the bad, and the ugly from this thing, and then sending that information properly to the right people in the government, the executive level or whatever like that, and our intelligence people, so that they have a better understanding of the phenomenon. And we can't have it, like to the point where they ignore it because it's a stigma or their personal beliefs. Bullshit. They need to be focused on the fact that this is in our territory, flying over a ship that they shouldn't be, in an area that's an exercise area where there's no TAMs that says you can't fly in that area. And now you're risking flight safety and everything else. We can't have that. We can't tolerate that. That's got to be stopped.
You're risking the health and safety of people within the other example that came up with the Havana syndrome. If I was a bad actor, I would love for conspiracy theorists to be like, it's an extraterrestrial disease or some fake disease. If I was Russia or China, oh man, I would capitalize on that to distract. If I had an actual weapon that could make people sick, I would love for conspiracy theorists to jump on that and call it everything except the real thing it is. The non-supernatural, non-paranormal, actual physical effect it is. That's exactly what Russia, if I was Russia or China, that's exactly what I would do if I had a weapon that could cause something like Havana syndrome. Let them call it alien. Let them call it NHI. That's the perfect cover.
Gentlemen, we're in a challenging environment to discern and detect the truth, and I appreciate you both for your efforts to do so. Just before we start to close up here, what's for you, why does this matter? What's the bottom line and your sense of the must going into this new year regarding, the UAP topic?
I guess for me, and the why am I engaging this, and what is my hope? And I think that ultimately, it's been said all along that it's the greatest discovery for the human kind that you can possibly get, which means that we need to keep studying it. I also am very concerned going forward with the fact that you have just think about all the bad actors and all the problems we got in the world right now. My concern is that ultimately those things are going to weigh bigger, which is expected, and the UAP thing is going to be down near somewhere about the bottom of the list in terms of any attention being paid on it. And so we have to be keeping that in the forefront and keeping that to the attention of all these leaders, that it's still important, despite the fact that you've got anti-satellite technology going on with the Chinese, or you've got Ukraine, or you've got this and you got that. There's too many distractions going on right now, and we've got to get that message carried forward and keep it growing. And we've also got to be able to keep the education going, because the American public does want answers, is very confused now about drones, and they want to tie it to UAP, which is not the right thing. So we need to get better about educating them. We need to get as many people, we need more shows like this. We need journalism and 101 to be engaging this. And I think that that's what we're all trying to do in the background. But again, it's for us to make any kind of progress, you have to have the attention of the executive level. You've got to have funding on it, and you've got to have that level of the ear. So going back, if Trump wants to talk about this every day in meetings, great. It's definitely going to get something. When I hear the State of the Union, and if I don't hear about the fact that UAPs are out there and we need to do something with it, guess what? It's not going to get the attention from anybody sitting up in that congressional box hearing it.
Hmm.
So you get where I'm going, right?
Yeah, and
That
Rich, I hear a crisis point, which is, we may never come to know because there was too many things in the way. There was too much
Yes,
human chaos. And whether it was intended, an orchestration, or whether it was our own just species chaos, we may never come to know.
right.
But that would be tragic.
It would be.
Yeah, thank you. Matthew, how about for you?
Well, on that note, I think that all that human chaos, I've said this on numerous podcasts, none of it's important. Yeah, I know people are dying in Gaza and Ukraine. None of that is relevant if non-human intelligence exists. It means all of our human squabbles are petty and unimportant. We are fighting over an anthill when there are things much bigger than us, the ants out there, if there are advanced non-human intelligence. So like not all of our wars, all of our disagreements, again, none of it is important if even one single UFO out of the thousands of unexplained cases, if even one turns out to have been a alien spaceship or some other craft, interdimensional, I don't care what it is. If even one was, That is the single most important discovery in human history. It's more important than anything else. It's more important than the war in Ukraine. It's more important than China. It's more important than Israel. It's more important than all those things put together and multiplied by, I don't know, 10,000, 10 trillion. It's much more important. We would finally have an answer to the age-old philosophical, religious, theological, and scientific question of, are we alone in the universe? Are we the only intelligent, rational species? We were talking earlier about consciousness. All right, so here's a connection that'll make people happy. We're all about UFOs and consciousness. Here's an important question. Are we the only conscious beings in the universe? The only beings with a consciousness, with a self-awareness? That's a very important question. To me, that question trumps all of the other questions. It trumps the questions about war and peace and politics, all of that. Again, it would be like it's like the two ants fighting over the anthill, like Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Hamas, and it's like, but there are bigger things in the house outside of the
Right.
garden, that are way more important than your little anthill that you're fighting over. Like, it is not relevant. The Earth is a tiny speck in the cosmos. And many people have said this already, but I'll say it again, right? It is irrelevant who controls what tiny portion of planet Earth, a tiny insignificant planet in the cosmos. That is not important. And that sounds like an anti-religious, that it's only a scientific perspective. It's also a very pro-religious perspective for me, because it also ties in with loving everybody and loving your enemies and getting all that ties in right with that. It's like,
Yeah.
but it just comes at it from another perspective. Is why should we get along and all love each other and not have war? Because we're not the only game in town. Because if I were a bad actor, NHI, not human bad actor NHI, I would love the fact that humans still undergo war in the 21st century. We still kill each other? Really? Like, we still kill each other. That's insane. Like, how is that still a thing? How is murder and war still a thing in the 21st century? Shouldn't we have outgrown those things as a species by now? Surely.
Mm-hmm.
And if I was a bad actor, NHI, I would love the fact that humans are not unified, because that means we're easy to conquer and we're easy to manipulate because we're not unified. And we still hate each other and we still fight each other. We don't even give basic human rights to every human being yet in the year 2025.
We are vulnerable in the universe. Thank you for that, Matthew. That insightful. And contact can be the unifier, and that's the reverse power of it. So it both ends the significance of our conflicts, but also gives us means to ending them. And there's the consciousness angle as well. Gentlemen, great to talk with you. And this has been fascinating for me as a non-scientist and a non-academic to listen to. And I'm happy to have brought these perspectives out. And this definitely challenged some of my thinking. I hope it did for others. So I want to thank you both for being on the show. And this, I'm sure, will be part one, and there's other parts to come. So thank you for your work. And with that, we'll sign off. And you guys can drop it whenever you're ready, and we'll be in touch, I'm sure, down the road. I'll say a few things to close up the show. I have some information for both Matthew and Rich here. We can put this on screen. So some links to share with you. An article I highly recommend against addressing some of the common criticisms against UAP. I read this as well, and I thought it actually kind of helped me up my rhetorical argumentation and my logic in response to some of the most common kind of dismissals of UAP. So I recommend this article by Matthew. These are the two research papers, one on catastrophic disclosure, and then another presentation with slides from Matthew as well. So I encourage you to head over and view those. And then for Rich, a few links where you can be in touch with him. And I definitely recommend going over to the SCU website and the research tab and seeing the publications that they're putting out. And, maybe that doesn't look like, the grand slam or the silver bullet, but, this is meaningful movement. This is grounds upon which further academic research can be undertaken. And we need that. We need solutions from all angles. And I know people are being called into this effort from, you know, all sectors of society. I'm one of them. Some viewing this are also, and we're not all scientists, and some of us are. So I think we all need to pick up and do what we can, and basically tell the world what we know in the way that we would tell it. And that I view as a form of citizen disclosure. I do it all the time. I talk to people about this phenomenon all the time because I know some things and I can tell them about that. And I'm sure you know some things. So instead of hoping for government or the executive branch or, one, smoking gun piece of evidence to come out, I think we all need to take up our piece of this and get our species transitioned into some awareness of what it's a part of in this universe. So it's a powerful moment. It's a calling for those who feel it. And if you are feeling it, you know who you are, and there are ways to respond. So thank you for doing that. As I look into the new year, I'm excited for where we can go on this show. I have a number of really amazing guests, thought leaders in various fields who are going to be getting on with me and walking around the issue 360 with what happens when our species, the human family, comes into some greater awareness that anomalous vehicles, craft, objects, phenomena, if we want to broaden out, which we might want to. I heard that today. That was important. As we come into an awareness of that and the potential reality that there's a non-human intelligence behind it, what does that do to our world? How do we integrate this awakening and constructively move in this direction, preferring positive outcomes according to human interests and human needs for development and security? Because we don't know what we're stepping out into. There might be bad actors out there. I would imagine there are good actors as well, but we don't know what we'll encounter first. And so we need to keep our heads about us, think logically, think cautiously and responsibly, and think human, which is to say, use our full set of human capabilities and bring those to bear as we assess the phenomenon that's in front of us. And I think citizens can assess this as well as those who have expertise in various fields. But we can't wait for the experts to be thinking in the way that we need to think. That's on us to do. So, with that, I recommend claiming one's agency and being a part of this process of helping our world and our humanity emerge, transition into some awareness of its larger involvement in an ecosystem of life out there. On the next episode of Emergent, we're going to be taking this conversation on the present and future of UAP science and research into the policy space. And I'm going to have some folks who have immense expertise in that field join me on the show and talk about what does it mean to advocate for UAP transparency within the context of the new administration. What do we need? What do we need to be saying? What are the various possible options to get the UAP Disclosure Act back on the table for consideration in Congress? Lester Nare is going to be joining me from the UAP Disclosure Fund and a few other friends as well. So stay tuned. I look forward to that episode. And from there, we're going to be broadening back out into the larger, bigger picture of issues, whether it's national world security, ontology, the reality and the nature of being, spirituality and religion, world affairs, and the reality and potential of nuclear escalation and other conflicts emerging in the new year. A lot of different sides of how this may erupt into some level of greater human awareness. So, with that, thank you so much for being with me. Let's have a great 2025 and let's have the conversations we need to be having. Please like and subscribe and share this show with others. I would love to grow this in the new year and get more people in this space thinking logically and in a grounded, responsible way when it comes to UAP and NHI. So, with that, I'll say good night and I will see you in 2 weeks' time. Take care.